Kia ora tātou, we'll get underway. We just started our live stream. This afternoon we have the Farm Environmental Plan Audit Program. Sitting at the table we have Judith and Mark, so hand over to you, Judith.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for having us along today. The purpose of this briefing is to just really provide probably most of the newer councillors, although not that new now, around our current Farm Environment Plan and Audit Program that we have in place in Canterbury. We've called this part 1 of 2, and part 2 of 2 will be looking at freshwater farm plans, etc., but it'll be probably later in July when we bring that to you. So just really felt it was important for understanding the current system we have and how we got to where we are, so that then we're in a really good position when we look at what does it take to get to where we need to be. So thanks again for having us here. Look, Environment Canterbury, just as a bit of context, has had a long history of looking at the role of farm environment plans for a way of demonstrating practice towards outcomes. I remember back in about 2008 and 9 having workshops on this in this area, but very much in an education engagement role as a voluntary practice for enabling land users to identify where there's issues and opportunities and actions to take them, to take action. In 2011, we were more formally looking at arrangements around audited self-management, where there was overarching management plans for catchment outcomes, and within that, the farm plan as a mechanism to demonstrate that practice. And then, of course, it became within the Land and Water Plan and as part reflected in Schedule 7 of that plan. So it's been quite a journey, and fundamental to that journey has been working with the rural industry and community all along the way. So we're going to describe that a little bit as we go on, but I just want to hand over to Mark for the next bit.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So Mark Fitzpatrick, I'm the Manager of Water and Land, for those of you who I haven't met before. So thank you for having us here today. Definitely the highlight of your day to learn about the Farm Environment Plan system and process. So the reason I'm presenting to you guys is because I am the Manager of the Water and Land Unit, and so just to reinforce or to remind you of what we do, we're the non-regulatory community-facing arm of the operations function here at ECAN. So we engage directly with landowners and industry to prompt the necessary action for the outcomes that we're seeking that isn't mandated through consents and compliance. The FEP system itself is managed by our Senior Farm Plan Advisor, Melissa Gillespie, within my team. And she's supported by compliance support officers, Chelsea Glee, Gemma Carmichael and Lauren Harvey, who you may have encountered along the way. And so here today with me, there's a lot of detail within the presentation. And so we do have the experts here in the room today. We have Melissa, who's run the program now for 5 years. We have Siri Heddle, who's a Principal Farm Systems Advisor here as well. And we've also got Zella Smith, our Principal Planning Advisor. So if you do have questions at the end that you would like to ask them, then they're here to be able to support with the detail if that's what you like. So there's a few things that we're going to cover today up on screen, but fundamentally what we hope you leave with is confidence in the system, recognising that it is a high quality system, that it's improved over time. You have any assumptions tested and clarified, and any questions you might have and queries answered, and fundamentally understand that the FEP audits team is committed to continuous improvement, and that has been demonstrated along the journey, but we'll go into the future also. So starting off first with what a farm environment plan actually is. So it is a tool that the farmer uses to identify, manage and mitigate environmental risk associated with water, soils and nutrients on their farm. It's unique to each farm and considers the farm system type, management practices and the local environment. It covers risk identification, looking at areas on the farm that are vulnerable to nutrient loss, management strategies specific to actions for land, water, nutrient and stock management, supporting plans such as effluent, biodiversity and irrigation plans, and record keeping. So it documents the current practices and future environmental goals. In contrast, an FEP audit typically involves the auditor obtaining evidence that the auditee is meeting the agreed expectations, which verifies the actual on-farm practice and assessing how this manages the risk of contaminant loss to ground or surface water. And we'll cover off in a bit of detail as we go through.
We wanted to put this slide in to show you that we recognise the place of our current regulated farm environment plan in the context of the Canterbury community, the farmers in that community and the industries that also are related to those farm activities. So this slide indicates is that the range of industry good organisations, businesses, etc., and all have had some role to play in both the farm environment plan development and the audit guidance development over time, but also we were heavily involved back in the day with our good management practice and matrix of good management practice as well. So it's been really important as a principle that there's buy-in to this approach in systems, and that there's also the opportunity for those businesses, companies to utilise the tool in their own businesses. So hence the ability to have their templates verified as meeting the requirements of Schedule 7 rather than just being an ECAN document. So it's so just anything else you want to cover off, Mark?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that again, just to reinforce, the FEP itself is a tool for the farmers, which is why they're in larger font and bolded up there. And on top of that, our team continues to engage with the community. There's an audit reference group that has members from multiple industry bodies that meets regularly with our team. So we're continuing to maintain this touch point with the industry as we go forward.
This slide, I meant in my introduction, I mentioned some of the early work of just what is the role of a farm plan or a farm management plan. They often have different titles, and that predated the Land and Water Plan, even probably before this slide. But it does just recognise that it's been in place in some contexts within the rural industry for some time. Back in 2010, Fonterra actually began providing environment planning tools to farmers. As one example, as well as some of the irrigation schemes, I'm thinking Morven, Glenavy, etc., having arrangements that were in place where there was environmental scheme consents that had a requirement for farm environment plans within there. So we just wanted to highlight that there was a lot of work underway prior to it actually becoming embedded as Schedule 7 in the Land and Water Regional Plan. And I guess the interesting reflection, if we think forward, is there'll be that ongoing work as well with a transition to freshwater farm plans and whatever legislative arrangements are around that. So I just really wanted to highlight those stages. One big piece of work that we did do very early on, probably around the 2012-13 period, was starting the development of an audit manual. So there were a lot of concern about what would audit look like, what does it mean for farmers, and we involved a lot of industry, including MPI, as part of that, with the reflection that there might be in the future some more wider application for a farm plan environment system.
And so the only thing to add to the slide is, I guess, look, over the last 10 years, what we have now is an environmental management program that's really well embedded within the Canterbury farming context, and it's driven and continues to drive significant behaviour change and upskilling across both the regulator and community alike. And that has been a long journey. It's taken us a long time to get to where we are today, but today it's just a matter of course as part of the farming space. Right, so where are we now? So while FEPs and FEP audits are excellent tools for managing on-farm risks, they're also our primary regulatory tool for consented farming in Canterbury. So Schedule 7 management objectives and targets within the Land and Water Regional Plan were developed based on industry-agreed GMP, but they're not identical to GMP. The key distinction is often overlooked, I guess, for ease of communication. Both the industry GMP and Schedule 7 have evolved over time to reflect the shifting priorities of each party. For instance, the inclusion of mahinga kai into the water bodies management objective under our Schedule 7 was an addition. Crucially, regarding Schedule 7 development, the legal agreement set out in consents dictates the FEP requirements to the specific version of Schedule 7 at the time that they got that consent. So that means that each consent's audit criteria are not live, and it doesn't change with the release of an updated Land and Water Regional Plan change. Consequently, the FEP audit scope will naturally differ across different generations of consents. Schedule 7 is incorporated into consents through consent conditions that refer to the FEP appendix, which is located at the bottom of the consent decision documents. And this appendix details the consent's relevant management objectives and targets alongside the provisions outlining how the audit should be undertaken. As of June of this year, we have 1,366 individual FEP audits that have been completed by 20 certified FEP auditors, with 2 additional auditor applications currently in progress. And talking to Jude before, there was a perspective that we would, early in the day, that we were going to end up needing hundreds of auditors across Canterbury to be able to respond to the demand that was going to emerge. We've got 20 that are highly effective and thus far have managed to do 1,366 audits. So prior to 2021, the FEP audit program focused on engagement and behaviour change, introducing a new system and regulatory tool for all of Canterbury. Once the community had adapted into the system, the Senior Farm Plan Advisor was brought in July 2021, and this position sought subject matter expertise in auditing frameworks to further build the robustness of the auditing program. So a range of improvements were undertaken, largely behind the scenes and unbeknownst to many in the rural community. They included setting up our internal procedures, the clearer direction and addressing the wide range of consent variations that existed in the individually consented farm planning space. From the rural community perspective, though, the biggest change that impacted auditing was the development and formalisation of those auditor guidance documents. So this has an associated interpretation risk of moving the goalposts, because there was a shift in the audit standards. However, that was not the intent. The introduction or refinement of those guidance documents ensured that all auditors were interpreting the expectations consistently. This ensured that an audit undertaken on a property would see less variation with differing auditors. So as a result, we saw auditors learning and adapting their auditing approach in some areas. And this has now been complemented by the addition of calibration exercises that are undertaken on auditor training days, and we'll talk about a bit of more information later on. In addition to setting those consistent expectations, over time we've seen changes that needed to be adapted for a number of reasons. So one was the response to the overseer peer review, which moved us away from absolute reliance on the overseer outputs, which changed how we audited the nitrogen loss limit. There was a shift in the development of new tools or removal of common tools like the dairy effluent storage calcs, and the removal of the CropX bucket testing. So continuous improvement has been applied. Importantly, once we have approved any developments or there are updates on expectations, those are released. So anything that impacts the on-the-ground auditing is made publicly available on the Farmers Hub. So that includes guidance documents or the auditor's manual. Otherwise, it's shared with the relevant parties. So FEP certification SOP was released out to all of the FEP auditors, by way of example. This is one area that the FEP audit team are looking to make improvements in, is communications and guidance for the rural community. So there's already been trialled and seen positive engagement with those involved, but they're committed to continuous improvement. And at the end of today's presentation, we'll touch on further learnings from the program evaluation that we're undertaking in 2025. So what does an audit actually entail? Well, as I've already said, the auditor obtains evidence that the auditee is meeting the agreed expectations on farm. So it includes verifying actual on-farm practice and assessing how this manages the risk of contaminant loss to ground or surface water. So a few key points that we want to leave you with in this regard. First, our FEP auditors verify on-farm management against the FEP Appendix Management Objectives and Targets. This requires interpretation, hence why we've developed the guidance documents. This is their audit criteria scope, not the FEP document. It's largely because we did not include an approved, evaluated or certified FEP within our regulatory framework. So it's the standards, not the FEP itself, that get audited, or the actions against the standards. The second thing is ECAN manages an FEP audit framework or program, but we don't have a formalised FEP document program. So the documents are often seen as a tool for the consent holder to identify their risks and manage those. However, as they are a requirement under a consent condition, that condition can be monitored by a compliance officer if required. They're also used during the consent application process. So the audit doesn't relate to the FEP. The FEP is required as a consent condition. Because it's required as a consent condition, there can be compliance against it, but that's not part of the FEP auditing system. So there's some a bit of nuance there. Okay. We'll bring up one of the experts to talk in detail if you like that toward the end. All right. Okay, so the FEP, we don't have a formalised FEP document program. The FEP documents are a tool for the consent holder to manage their own risks. They're also a requirement within the consent condition. Yep. So they're a tool for the farmer needs an FEP. Because that condition exists within the consent, the condition itself can be monitored by compliance. So have you got an FEP? But that compliance itself isn't part of the FEP audit process.
And yet everything that sits within my FEP is checked through as part of audit compliance, hence my confusion.
The final thing is that the FEP appendix itself does not cover the complete suite of land and water regional plan rules or the wider environmental regulation. The auditors aren't warranted officers, and so the risk may demand a higher degree of management than accounted for in the regulatory frameworks. The key here is that the audit is not equivalent to compliance monitoring. We've got a bit more detail on that in one of the upcoming slides. So this is an overview of the audit process itself, and it's got many steps and parties involved, all including a touch point within the consent holders. So when a consent with an FEP condition is activated, the FEP audit team sets up an audit due date in the system. It ensures the audit team can actively monitor the progress of the audits and maintain contact with the consent holders across a number of different stages. So the first is that the consent is activated. An email sent upon grant or transfer or partial surrender. This outlines the FEP audit responsibilities, assigns a specific due date, provides direct links to resources, etc. Then there's a 4-month pre-audit reminder, another email notification outlining the steps for the upcoming audit. It includes an SMS reminder as well, where mobile details are available. And it reshares the FEP checklist and website guidance. Then there's an audit due date, requests a status update on the audit stage and provides tailored next steps based on farmer progress, and finally a post-audit follow-up 2 months later, which is an initial phone call to verify the audit status or identify barriers to completion. Additionally, the team interacts with consent holders during extension requests, technical guidance requests, audit holds, or if there's been any audit decision panel outcomes. The senior farm plan advisors may also communicate with farmers about technical expectations or concerns or disputes and attend on-site audits roughly once a month for in-person engagement. When an FEP auditor submits the audit report through the online FEP audit tool, the data gets saved into a secured cloud. The grade, the audit date, and the auditor details are automatically provided to the FEP audit team so they can issue the CMR. Only the immediate FEP audit team, which is our senior farm plan advisor and the 3 compliance officers, have access to the full reports, easy access to the full reports. Data from those reports can be provided for fair and proper use when they make an information request following the release procedure. Only the senior farm plan advisor assesses these requests and released information if relevant. So it's quite a secure, robust process. And there's a lot of people that are involved. It is a collaborative approach. So throughout the audit program, there's a one ECAN approach with clear roles and responsibilities. Updates, interpretations, guidance, and decision-making includes input from water and land, compliance and consents at a minimum, and often science and biosecurity when required. The greatest strength of the program is the expertise held by those involved in the program. And the greatest loss is, of course, losing those people or the engagement itself. In addition, industry reps are engaged for the development of expectations and guidance, particularly those involved in the audit reference group. For instance, the irrigation auditor guidance was co-written with Stephen McNally from Irrigation New Zealand, reviewed and endorsed by the wider ARG, while the compost management project is an example of an FEP audit adjacent piece of work supported by members of the audit reference group as well. So we continue to maintain a very collaborative process within the system. So there's a bit more detail here about what's actually included in the audit itself. So an auditor shouldn't advise on how a farmer should demonstrate achievement of each target. Instead, it's up to the auditee or the farmer to provide a package of information to demonstrate how they have met each target. This is a key strength of the program because it's not a tick box exercise. Instead, the auditor proposes a simple question of what are your risks and how do you manage those, and leaves the determination of how to manage them in the hands of the farmer and their advisors. For instance, soils and cultivation target 1. Farming activities are managed so as to not exacerbate erosion. An auditee must provide evidence that they understand and manage their soil risks of erosion. It includes an understanding of the inherent risk, like the topography and the like, proximity to sensitive receptors, and how they manage their farming activities, cultivation type, period of fallow, shelter belts, etc. The auditor then determines what level of confidence the provided evidence gives them that the specific language of the target is being met. To do this, they're expected to undertake a live risk assessment, consistently adjusting to the new information provided by the consent holder. The process is then repeated for 21 different targets, give or take a few depending on their applicability. Not included in the FEP audit is achievement of national regs or consent conditions, not included under the FEP audit appendix, such as water telemetry. So once the audit's completed, they will get an A or B grade if they're compliant, or a C or D grade if they're non-compliant. One common area of contention within the program is the misconception that a compliant grade implies a property is compliant with all resource consent conditions and relevant regulations. It's not the case. In general, as long as the auditor has a high level of confidence that farming activities are being managed as required by the specific FEP targets, a compliant grade is issued. However, a property may have other resource consent conditions that aren't being met, such as water telemetry data, water body flow rates, distance from silage pits from boundaries and the like. And those elements are often not included within the scope or targets of the FEP itself. It's important to clarify that while a B grade is technically compliant with the resource consent, the property is not yet fully meeting the FEP audit expectations. Both B and C grades are issued to properties where the auditor only has a medium level of confidence for one or more targets. The real distinction between a B, compliant, and a C, non-compliant, isn't necessarily the severity of the concerns, but rather how the consent holder engages with those issues. So to achieve a B grade, the consent holder must acknowledge the gaps and implement a clear plan to address them. And that buy-in effectively allows them a 2-year window to get things sorted and meet expectations. Conversely, a C grade indicates the consent holder requires more formal support to implement a plan. In these cases, the report is shared with a LMA, a land management advisor, or a consent officer, a compliance officer rather, who then steps in under their mandate to either educate or enforce the audit expectations. As you can imagine, with a system as robust as this, there's a lot of quality assurance, and it can be broken down to the QA within the program and of our auditors. Internally, we ensure that any decisions or recommendations are undertaken with the best available information and that these decisions are consistent and documented. So there's a wide range of subject matter experts engaged throughout the FEP audit program, as we've already covered off. Internally, the audit decision panel requires decisions on the day-to-day operation of the FEP audit program. It may include compliance, legal or interpretation queries, audit extensions and the like. Alongside the experience within the panel, they also draw on senior leadership and legal and comms if required. The FEP audit team has built a productive and engaged relationship with the audit reference group, which I touched on earlier on. So it includes policy, technical and regional experts from Irrigation New Zealand, Pork New Zealand, Dairy NZ Beef and Lamb, Fed Farmers, FAR, Dairy NZ, Hort NZ and ISO programs, along with auditors and irrigation schemes. The panel is an advisory panel only, adhering to a terms of reference. They receive FEP audit program improvements prior to their approval so they can provide input into how those improvements could be improved from their point of view. In addition, they often share information back into ECAN about emerging issues or opportunities that they're hearing on the ground through their networks. Finally, once a piece of work has been developed, it follows an agreed approval process, and that identifies where there's a delegated mandate for CE approval or where a lower level of approval is sufficient. It's quite robust. From an auditor quality assurance perspective, FEP auditors are expected to not only have well-developed auditor skills, but also the technical expertise required to undertake live risk assessments to determine their level of confidence that the management addresses the risk of contaminant loss to ground and surface water on a wide range of topics. So the competency expectations and the QA relating to auditors must be robust. Should an auditor demonstrate that they're not meeting expectations, there's a range of penalties that can be applied. Initially, we use educational approaches like a written warning, improvement plans, or a period of supervision. When we have repeated instances of a concern, we also have the opportunity to revoke certification or not improve an auditor at their re-registration. Last couple of slides talk to the program's successes thus far and the improvements that we'd like to make going forward, and then we can open up for questions. So there's definitely a number of learnings that we've derived over the course of the program as shown on screen. 3 key learnings to take home from our perspective. First, successful uptake from the rural community driving behaviour change, and FEP is now just a part of farming within Canterbury, and that was not the case 10, 15 odd years ago. Second, we have robust systems to ensure the quality of the FEP auditing system. And finally, we have great subject matter experts, both in-house and in the industry, that are involved in the decision-making processes and support it to continue to be a robust process. In terms of improvements going forward and opportunities going forward, the 3 key ones that we pull out: rural comms of FEP expectations and implementation of rural guidance campaigns and use of rural matters and social media. So how can we be even better than we are in communicating FEP audit expectations out to industry, out to farmers, making sure that there's no surprises experienced for everyone involved in the system. We will continue to strive for improved understanding on the distinct yet complementary tools ECAN have to achieve the environmental outcomes. So FEP auditors, land management advisors, compliance officers and the likes. And finally, just to point out that while our FEP audit team is small, they are impactful. They've done incredible work. And so while there's opportunities to improve, further improvements are constrained at the end of the day by the amount of resource we have associated with it. And that will always be the case. Right, a lot of information there, but that's the end of the presentation. We'll take questions.
Thanks for that, Mark. Yeah, a lot of information. I can see John Faulkner itching to go, and then I'll go to Sarah and then Claire. Kia ora, John. Are you on the list?
Thank you. Mark, can I take you back to slide 6? And I don't know whether it was just before got in from lunch and the brain wasn't quite there. And to me, I kind of feel baffled by science. A lot of information in your explanation, and I would love a copy of that explanation so I can sit down and go through it. That would be really helpful. And one of the pieces that I want to ask you about in slide 6, there seems to be a confusion on the auditing process. I've had a couple of questions from up in the Hurunui in regarding the auditing process and the understanding of the Hurunui Waia regional plan and how that integrates with the auditing with the independent collectives and irrigation companies. So there seems to be an inconsistency in approach taken, and you kind of touched on it in your discussion around that slide. Can you go back to that and try and help me out?
Yep. Okay, so we'll go through it. And then if you've got some specific questions, we go pause. And again, Sarah and Melissa are here if we need to get into the details. So the Land and Water Regional Plan Schedule 7 has management objectives and targets, which have been developed based on agreed GMP, industry developed based on, doesn't directly reflect, so they're not identical to GMP. Both the industry GMP and the Schedule 7 have evolved over time, and that reflects the shifting priorities of each party, both ECAN and industry. For instance, mahinga kai, which is included in EastCan Schedule 7, but isn't necessarily reflected in GMP. So as a result of Schedule 7 development, the legal agreement set out in the consent dictates that the FEP requirements to the specific version of Schedule 7 at the time of consenting. So it was consented 10 years ago, then Schedule 7 10 years ago is what applies, not today. So each consent... No?
Just, can we get... Come up.
Okay.
Kia ora, ko Melissa Gillespie tōku ingoa. I'm the Senior Farm Plan Advisor. Some background onto that. So we've got 2 adjacent systems working, which we do have kind of throughout Waitaha. In the case of the Huranui region, is that we've got the plan up there that does account for permitted activities, given that they've got a farm environment audit happening. At the same time, we've got the Land and Water Regional Plan rules that require consented properties, and those consented properties have a consented requirement for a FEP audit. What we find, particularly in that area, is it's challenging to communicate because we've got 2 things running at the same time with really similar names, and they get confused. So when we're talking about the FEP audit program, in this sense, we're talking about the FEP audit program or the FEP audit proper noun as per the Land and Water Regional Plan for consented properties. So these are the ones that have a consented requirement for an FEP and an FEP audit. And if they've got a consented requirement, then they need to meet their consent agreements. Does that answer?
Claire, do you have a comment? No, Claire.
No, I think it was helpful just to explain the 2 FEPs, because that's one of my questions here. Comments was, we've talked a lot about the auditing of it through a land use consent, but we haven't. But what it's interesting that you say that you have to comply, from an auditing perspective, comply with what's on your land use consent. But that's, and if it's 5 years old or 10 years old, that's what you comply with. But that's not how it actually happens on practice at the other end, because you've got this iterative process that's going on all the time. So what you actually get audited again, and maybe John's probably the latest one that's been done here, is that it's greatly amplified from what you have in your consent conditions. My understanding is the land use consent is where they are generally put, and the FEP is generally the only part of that particular consent. And I know that that doesn't mean to say, and I'm hopefully at the rest of the councillors around the table understand that doesn't mean you're compliant with the other consents that you individually hold. So, and that does make it confusing from a compliance perspective, because we are now going to a risk basis and looking at whole farms. So there is a little bit of a complication there. But what we see as users at the end of it is that because of the iterative process and the expectation gets higher and higher year by year, and I'm not challenging that, it becomes, there's quite a gap between what might be on your consent and the standards maybe to what actually happens in reality. But I'll pass over to John.
I just comment from John.
Look, thanks, and that's the challenge. And I guess I was there, the writing of at the get-go from the initial meetings, about 4 people in a hall. And I've just been through mine, so I'm going to be very careful. I'm not challenging what I did on Friday versus the system. And with luck, I think I got a couple of A's, so that's fine. But the process has definitely changed, and the need to rewrite my farm environment plan. So I've spent $8,000 on having my consultants out on farm, looking at my farm environment plan, rewriting my farm environment plan to give effect to the interpretation of Environment Canterbury and the audit process today, which is a rewrite from 3 years ago, giving effect to the implication that was needed then. So when I hear you, Mark, saying you give effect to what it was at the time of the consent, that's not how it's applied to us. So I am rewriting a farm environment plan, which an auditor is then checking that I have given effect to the latest iteration of expectation from Environment Canterbury as to what the auditors will check on. They go, yep, that's fine, John, but we have now been told we need to concentrate on this, so we need to look at these things because that is now the emphasis Environment Canterbury is putting on. And if I'm not giving effect to it, I don't get an A. So, yep, absolute respect. We're advertising it, we're putting it on the website, but I don't read the website. I do get the upgrade information when I'm told that my process is coming up. I fire it into Ravensdown, they come on farm, we rewrite everything, but the shift is absolutely significant. So that's the challenge of our interpretation. It's a bit like the old IRD tax information bulletins, and you challenge them, they go, the law has not changed, Mr. Sunkel, but our interpretation of the law has changed, and therefore you will do what we say. It feels a bit like that. I'm not challenging the uplift and the need, but there is a significant change every time we audit in expectation of what things are.
Anything from that, Mark? Any response, Mark?
No, I guess I would just say that that's acknowledged, that there has been a effort to ensure consistency across auditors, and as the system has become more robust to deliver that calibration and that consistency, variation has been experienced on the front lines in engagement with farmers. And where there is instances where there is an experience that is felt unwarranted, then the team is there available to engage on that specifically. And we are intending to, as part of our next stage of continuous improvement, explore how we can be more proactive in engaging with shifts over time with farmers directly, rather than it being reactive and made available on a website for them to find out on their own. So it's on the horizon for us to be exploring that.
Kia ora. John Faulkner, anything else? Are you happy with that?
I'll probably come back later because I will have more questions, I think, once I get my lunch digested. And
Sarah?
So it's just going to the diagram. Sorry, in the middle of the other one. Well, I suppose it's actually during the refinements of. It's really about the evolution of the farm environment plans. So, sort of like the adaptability on how they can address new land uses, such as solar farms coming onto, maybe a dairy farm. It's sort of how do you does anything need to change? And how do you adapt? I mean, you might have a wetland on the farm and that has eel harvesting or whatever, so it's sort of the adaptation of different land uses within the.
I've a shot at responding, and if I'm wrong, Melissa will correct me. But look, the auditor's responsibility is to assess the identification of the risk and how effectively the farmer has managed in response to those and mitigated those risks. And so that does allow for shifts in farm system and changes over time. Obviously, new technologies and new approaches coming into the mix does happen, and that's what the audit reference group is there for. So we engage consistently with the industry, and as things become more pertinent or change risk profiles, then they can be considered. And again, this is why calibration and the process around that is so important.
Kia ora. Thanks, Sarah. Claire, did you have any more questions, or were you covered before?
No, other than this is a big topic, and we've had a lot of information, and we might have to go back at the start of part 2 and just to rehash it. And look, don't take this the wrong way. This is not about running down FEPs. I mean, they've certainly been a very, very useful tool, but it isn't very easy, some of the expectations out there. And composting, for an example, I mean, I've been involved in a little bit around this when we had Jack, wasn't it, that set up some of the initial work around this in the organisation. But by and large, other than the news flash that went out, I think in rural news, I haven't seen a hell of a lot more about it, particularly in North Canterbury. I know I think they're having a field day somewhere, or had one up in Amberley, but I mean, how do we get those sorts of changes? That's the challenge, I think, that people that are on the receiving end of auditors, you have to actually pay for somebody to come and do a run-through, or if you're a shareholder of an irrigation collective or a collective, they might do that as part of their responsibilities to make sure that everybody gets by. But there is lots of costs at each end of this that people pick up, and we just need to make sure that everybody knows what the expectations are. And that, I see, as our role to get that information out, and how we do that effectively.
Kia ora, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, there is lots of information, and we know this is part one of two-part series, so we look forward to the recap on the start of the part two. We'll go over to Ashley.
I have lots of questions. Some of them have been partially answered, but this is actually, for those of us who are new to this is extremely complex, and I'd say a good 60% of it went over here. So we probably need to have FEPs for newbies. That's true. That's true.
Next one.
True. Okay, so I'll ask the questions where I actually understand what I'm asking, as opposed to certified FEP auditors. Who certifies them, and what are their qualifications?
So I do. Yeah. So to be approved as an FEP auditor, you need 5 years experience, relative qualifications, and you also need to prove that or demonstrate competency against the FEP audit certification SOP competency criteria, which is quite a few pages at the back of that SOP. That's done through 2 witnessed on-site audits. So I will follow the auditor around for 2 audits, covering things from communication and questioning techniques, body language, critical analysis of the technical data, and also general rapport building chat. Then after those 2 assessments, they then submit the reports, which then undergo the same level of scrutiny. So whenever I'm reviewing the reports, the auditor needs to be able to demonstrate that just based on the report alone, they can justify that audit outcome. And once that has gone through and I've gone, I believe that this auditor meets all of the competency criteria, it then goes up all the way up to Stephanie for final sign-off as the decision maker.
Cool, thanks. I understood that. My next question, which is getting really basic as to what FEPs do and don't measure, and this, they measure identification of risks and stated management of those risks. Do they measure whether that management is actually happening or not?
Sorry to cut you off. So the FEP itself identifies the risks and the measures that the farmer can undertake to manage and mitigate those risks. Then the audit assesses the actual practice on farm against the criteria.
Thank you. That answers one thing. And my final question, audit reference groups. Has there been any thought given to having independent members on those reference groups who aren't attached to industry? For example, academics gets a bit difficult because industry funds lots of academic studies, but just in terms of, what we hear as all the time, has some thought been given to alleviating the perception of industry capture?
Exactly my question.
No, we haven't had independence before, but it could be explored with the ARG in terms of the discussion.
From my point of view, I think that would be a very useful thing to examine, to look into, because of the very strong perception in some quarters of industry capture. And I think that having some, and it would be difficult because most academics get a lot of their research paid for by various industries, but I think it could be quite useful for an exercise of how that could happen.
Thank you. Yep, that's noted for sure. Yep.
Kia ora, thanks, Ashley. So we've got still got a big afternoon in front of us. So we've got 7 more people for questions in 15 minutes. So succinct questions, straight to the point, and we'll move on. Kia ora, Genevieve.
I solely agree with Councillor Campbell's comments. We need independence on them to give it robustness of process. That's exactly what I had lined up. However, given that audits are a snapshot in time, what mechanisms exist to identify, I guess, poor performance occurring between audits? Is it just the compliance and monitoring, or does that feed into the next audit stage, or does it trigger an earlier audit?
Yeah, look, the FEP itself is a snapshot, and when the audit occurs is at that point in time. There's the amount of work that's required on farm to be able to deliver on the management and mitigation of those risks is not insignificant. And in particular, when you think about the ability to demonstrate that that's what you have achieved over the timeline preceding the audit itself, you've got to be able to provide evidence that you have effectively managed those risks. And so pending there being records that don't reflect actual practice, then the audit is pretty robust in exploring what's occurred over the prior time. Outside of the audit process itself, yes, there's general compliance management and the ability to respond to events.
Just a second onto that about the actual 25 auditors. So they're assessed and certified through us. Are they our pool of auditors, or are they independent?
So they are set up as independent auditors, and they get verified through our process or certified through our process, and then they are available to the market for farmers to be able to utilise to conduct the audit on their property.
Kia ora, thanks, Mark. Moving on, Megan.
That was such a fast run through. I'm going to have to actually listen it back because it just went at such a pace that it was hard to keep up. So you might have answered this. But starting this process, the first place I went to was to read Schedule 7, and I had confidence once I read it that it was really clear to say what a plan shall include, including the objectives and targets and sub-regional, information. I thought, okay, I'm feeling really confident with this. This is looking good. And then I've looked at it hearing it from a different perspective. I'm a little bit at the other end of the scale. I'm not worried about industry capture. I'm a little bit worried about the people coming into our system and leaving our system, and who's making decisions at what point, and it changing. And what I mean by that is the world is not as I thought it was. First of all, I thought an A was better than just you are compliant. So that's helpful for me today. The other part is I had it in my mind that as a group of governors, we would appoint independent commissioners that set our rule framework. Then in that, there is delegations to staff at the time that the consent is issued. I did not think for one moment that it was a continuous reiterative experience for the people who hold those consents to have a change in audit from year 2 to year 1, year 2, year 3, depending on if they're an A, B or C. And so I'm wondering, how could that be legally compliant with the planning framework, that somebody is making a different decision. And where that sits with me is anybody who's been part of regulatory hearing committee recently, we've been talking about quality assurance and how commissioners are appointed. And here we're appointing auditors who are changing the goalposts, right? That's what we've heard, changing the goalposts. And yet we're the ones that certify them. And we may call them independent, but they only get to be auditors through our certification process. So this has got some red flags for me about who is making the decisions and why are they changing from the point of consent to the point of the next consent? How do we have confidence in that from our user experience perspective?
So the question is how the confidence we have in the process itself.
I think the first question is this true from what we've just heard before, that the auditor, so you get your consent, you have a farm environment plan compliant with Schedule 7, you get your audit, you got an A, why would you then need to change something again? Why does it change next time? That's the part I'm finding hard to follow.
So through the process of calibration and seeking consistency among auditors, prior to that, there was different farms and different locations with different auditors that would have different interpretations of the same thing. And so what we have sought is to achieve a calibration and a consistency across the board so that all auditors, as close as reasonably possible, are consistent with their interpretation of what is required on farm. And noted that is experienced as a shifting of the goalposts, but it was a process of calibration.
I've got it, and I've just got kind of one follow-up to that, which is, again, the risk lens to it. So what I just heard is, we screwed it up the first time because we didn't have some consistency, and now we're actually having better consistency, and now that means that Mr. X has to spend $8,000 to do their new farm environment plan again. Because that's really what I heard, that in the beginning we didn't have consistency across our auditors, which meant that now we're doing it better by having a consistent framework. Well, isn't that on us, not others?
I think this is probably one we'll go away and explore and come back to you if that's all right. No, I'd like to delve into it in a bit more detail and come back to you.
Kia ora, thanks. Moving on, Ian.
Cool. Look, can I just comment on Megan's question there, because I think it's been lost in the presentation. The iterative process on the consents is required because on your consent conditions you have to comply with your FEP, and so that is an open-ended, and that's caught out a lot of people and a lot of individual consent owners, understanding that the FEP part of the consent condition is actually iterative, depending on which sub-regional plan you sit under. So the sub-regional plans, especially if you're in some of those with high nitrate areas, require people to reduce their environmental impact to meet the catchment plans for the overall outcome of water quality. So in the Hines Plains, you've got to get down to 6.9 parts per million of nitrates in the surface water as measured in various points across the. And so if you're above, but then there's an exemption for those that are under the limit. So there was a limit of 15 parts per million, and if you sat under that, then you actually don't have to change. So your consent doesn't require you to show further nitrate losses. But if you're above that, you actually have to come down by 30% or 15%, depending on where you sit on the spectrum. So that is part of the iterative process of the FEP.
Known at the time of consent.
Known at the time of consent, yes. But then it's confusing, because if you have a consent for an effluent discharge, for example, that has specific consent conditions. But the audit process then says, oh, you need to have continuous improvement, but the consent actually doesn't say that and so that's. But then if they say, oh well, your farm consent, your consent to farm actually requires you to meet the requirements of the FEP. And if, for example, Fonterra changes the rules around effluent storage, that's part of the requirement to meet those new change rules. So it's a dog's breakfast in terms of, from a farmer's perspective, trying to keep up with all the changes.
Good, Ian. So have you got a question, or was that
Yeah, I was just answering that because I thought it was a useful interjection. My question really is, and I think it's an important question, is how much has it cost Canterbury as a whole implementing the FEP program? And it goes to Ashley's question about what are we measuring? Are we measuring the environmental outcomes that have come as a result of this program? Because we were told earlier in this year, was it, or at the end of last year, that we're not measuring the outcomes of this program, but we don't know what the total cost is. But have we done those numbers yet?
No, I don't believe. I certainly haven't seen the numbers, but we'll take that one away in terms of the cost of the program as a whole. And then in terms of the outcomes, that the FEP system is the FEP system, and that's what it is that we manage.
Yeah, no. I understand the FEP, and you're measuring compliance with the FEP. What I'm interested in is, given that this program's been implemented at huge cost. I'm not pushing back on the intent of the program. What I'm saying, it's come at huge cost. I want to know that we are measuring environmental outcomes that are a result of the FEP program. Otherwise, and if we're not doing that, and we can't say this program is working, we may have just squandered squillions of dollars of other people's money.
Yeah, we can explore those questions and come back.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. Take it away. Thank you for that. John, was this following on from this, or is it separate?
It is following on for it. You look up there in the top right-hand corner, change in management or significant change in farm systems. Okay, I've just gone out and spent $2 million on environmental improvement, and I fall in the A grade category, 4-year between audits, and now I have to have another audit. So doesn't it seem inconsistent when the auditing process is trying to drive positive change, and people that make positive change have to fall into a 1-year audit, re-auditing process? And doesn't that seem that things should be reviewed and re-looked at again?
Kia ora. So with the change of management, it is not change in your practices per se or your improvement in practices. The system is designed to allow for decision making to happen on farm in a farm system that works for the farmer. With change in management, what we're talking about is when the auditable variables have changed substantially so that the last audit no longer applies. So this is where, say, the individual who is making management decisions has changed, and therefore all the evidence that we collected in the last audit that pertained to knowledge and decision making is now longer null and void because that person is no longer the one making the decisions. So that's what it means by change in management. It is not when you're making improvements to.
No, I'm not.
Sorry, John.
Farm system. So farm system, when I say management, I haven't employed somebody for $2 million to run the farm. I'm saying I changed the system and put in an environmental composting barn that will reduce discharge to water of N. So that is a farm system. So I've triggered it by that process. I understand the farm management.
So the significant change in farm system doesn't pop up through our system very frequently. It's usually when someone has reached out to us and contacted us to let us know. And we're talking, again, because the system allows you to make substantial changes, it might be that you've gone from one farm system into a completely different farm system. And therefore, your risk management needs to change.
I think what's clear here is that your changes of practice on farm does not trigger the need for a 1-year audit.
Has triggered it with AIC.
Something, John, you can discuss later on. Anyway, moving on. We've got 2 questions left. Andrea, Nick, let's go fast.
This is really easy. Those SOPs, is that a national framework? No, just us. Okay. I did have a question about the digital tools that some of our auditors could use and need, and I've heard other parts of the organization, some GIS training for some of these younger people, and I'm wondering if that's what you mean by that, digital tools?
So with the digital tools, we are talking about the digital frameworks that the auditors are operating within. So that is our online submission tool, and there are some things that we could do to make it more streamlined.
I think I want to engage more on this, and should I just email Judith or Mark? Or yeah, okay. Thank you.
Right, kia ora. I remember to CC someone in. Yeah, kia ora. Nick.
Thanks, Mark. Sounds like you're leading some good, rigorous work here. I'll keep it brief and just the high-level governance questions really to just a second. Some of the questions we've heard around maintaining the independence of the farm auditors and the farm audit process, auditing the auditors to maintain the public trust and that key 20 people who do the 1,366 audits, and also support Councillor Mackenzie's questions around do we check that all this work is delivering the hoped for improvements in water quality and report on that. So maybe questions for part 2 of the presentation to flag. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you for that, team. As you've heard, there was a lot of learning. Please reflect on that for the part 2 with the freshwater farm plans, and as kind of John said, that's what's looking at for the future anyway. So kind of understand where we've come from, where we can go to, but also just in the presentations, just kind of, as Ashley said, 101. So on that, we'll just pause there for a second while we change. Kia ora tātou, we're back online here. We're moving on to second briefing this afternoon, air quality management in Waitaha, Canterbury. Hand over to you, Cam.
Excellent, thank you. Good afternoon, councillors. So I'm pleased to bring this briefing to you on air quality in Canterbury. I send apologies from Amy Ellison, who would usually be leading this, and she's away ill. Before I get started, just a couple of quick introductions. You've met Tom Scott, who's a team leader in the regional strategy space. To have Teresa Abakan, who's a principal science analyst in our science directorate, and Miranda Charles, who's a strategy advisor in Tom's team. So we're here today to provide you with an overview of the work being done to manage regional air quality and provide context for an upcoming staff report to the Strategy and Policy Committee. There is quite a bit of information in here, and we will try to get through it, noting you've got an important briefing after this. However, we can come back with further information if required. So the link between air quality and public health is well established, and as a council, we are required to monitor and report on ambient air quality and manage the localised effects of discharges to air. We have been making good progress to meet national environmental standards over the past 2 decades. However, we still face a few challenges in certain areas with certain pollutants. On top of this, dust remains a contested issue around Christchurch quarry zones. And today's briefing foreshadows a report to the Strategy and Policy Committee on the 17th of June to set direction on a potential dust monitoring program. I will hand over to the team. Thank you.
Thanks, Cam. Kia ora koutou, ko Miranda tōku ingoa. Hi, my name is Miranda Charles, and I'm a strategy advisor with the Regional Strategies team. As Cam mentioned, the purpose of today is to provide an overview of the organisation's roles and responsibilities for managing air quality, and to provide a context for an upcoming staff report to the Strategy and Policy Committee on a potential dust monitoring program. You'll see a lot of slides today that read as notes pages, and we did this so that you could prepare for the session or have a good browse through after it and still understand what we're covering. We don't intend to read the slides or expect you to do the same, but we just ask that you focus on some key messages and note down your questions as we go. So the briefing is in two parts. We're going to provide an overview of air quality and health and the regulatory context for the organisation's roles and responsibilities for air quality interventions. And also we're going to explain how we perform against national environmental standards and local targets. The second part of the briefing is to provide a background overview of dust in and around Christchurch quarry zones, and also to discuss key initiatives and next steps. So when we speak today about air quality and public health, we're talking about the impact of airborne particulate matter on our bodies. Particulate matter comes from both natural and human-made sources, and Teresa is going to provide a really good overview of that as she discusses our progress on air quality standards and trends. So the slide in front of you shows the different impacts of sources of different sizes, different size particles. And you're going to hear us talk about PM10 a few times today. That describes particles with a diameter of 10 microns, and that includes both coarse and fine particles. Smaller, finer particles are described as PM2.5, and it's those particles that are known to cause the most harm to human health, much more so than coarse particles. Our legislative mandate largely comes from the Resource Management Act, called the RMA, and related national environmental standards, which we often refer to as the NESAC. The RMA speaks to the life-supporting capacity of land, water and air, and the NESAC sets out the limits for airborne particles and certain gases, and these are measured over specific timeframes, such as hourly or daily averages. This slide also refers to our internal policy framework for measuring our progress and managing ambient air quality and discharges to air from home heating, industry and agriculture, etc. Chapter 14 of the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement, we often refer to that as the RPS, and the Canterbury Air Regional Plan, the CARP, as well as the long-term plan, have policies and provisions linked to our role in air quality. Internally, our air quality responsibilities cut across all three services, but for the most part, air quality activities fall under environmental regulation and protection. In addition to monitoring and reporting on air quality, our approach includes a cleaner home heating program, which encompasses financial subsidies, wood burner and wood supply accreditations, and public education and awareness campaigns. Consenting and compliance activities which apply our air quality policies and rules and help us to respond to incidents and complaints. Our approach also includes sector partnerships with a wide range of organisations. And we also undertake future planning activities to respond to emerging science, technology and national policy direction. Where possible, we endeavour to create strong alignment with transport and urban land use planning to achieve air quality outcomes. Under proposed legislative reform, air quality management could materially change. We're not 100% sure how, but our sector leaders and community voices are asking the following questions. Who will govern our air quality system? How much local direction will remain? How strongly might environmental protection compete with development priorities? And will environmental oversight weaken if governance becomes more development focused? And as for other work streams, we will keep you apace of updates to our current understanding of how reform might affect our responsibilities and our priorities, especially in the context of any discretionary monitoring programs. So I'll hand you now over to Teresa, who will discuss some recent air quality trends and performance against national standards.
Oh, sorry. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Teresa Aho. My role is in the science group
and I've been involved with monitoring general air quality in Canterbury for more than 30 years. So that is the air that's not directly impacted by discharges, just we refer to it as ambient air quality. This graph shows two examples of improvement in air quality over the last 26 years. These markers show the number of days when the National Environmental Standard for PM10 was exceeded each year in the Timaru airshed, the green markers, and the Christchurch airshed, the red markers. There is variation from year to year, but overall the trend shows far fewer days than in the early 2000s. That is from changes to how we heat our homes. Cleaner heating rules, wood burner replacement requirements, education campaigns, and support for better burning practices have helped improve air quality across Waitaha. That improvement may have plateaued in the more recent years, which we will focus on next in the next slide and include all 8 Canterbury airsheds. So looking at the table on the left first, this shows how monitoring in each airshed has compared to the PM10 National Environmental Standard, with the green ones compliant and the red ones not. Washdyke is an industrial area in the north of Timaru and has the highest ranking for PM10 in the left table. This is followed by Timaru City and Kaiapoi. The table on the right shows fine particles, PM2.5, in comparison to our 2030 regional planning targets. That's the Canterbury Air Regional Plan. You may recall from earlier when Miranda was speaking about particle size that PM2.5 is a subset of PM10. In most of our airsheds, the majority of PM10, when concentrations are highest, are those smaller fine particles, with very few coarse particles. This results in very similar PM10 and PM2.5 concentrations. Why we see a difference in these tables is because the PM2.5 guideline is half the amount of the PM10 one, and so there are many more exceedances of that value. There are variations from year to year, usually based on the winter weather. That is how cold, calm and frosty it was between May and August, when the highest concentrations usually occur in most airsheds. The one airshed that has the lowest PM2.5 concentrations is Washdyke, where coarse particles are the main source of PM10 rather than fine particles. These coarse particles occur all year round and come from many sources in Washdyke, including sea salt, fertiliser works, asphalt plant, grain silos, landscaping suppliers, industrial stacks, and vehicle movements on dusty, unpaved surfaces. Washdyke is an example of how PM10 and PM2.5 concentrations could look in the middle of a dusty area. Before 2019, monitoring in Washdyke, 500 metres to the west of the current site, only had 1 PM10 exceedance per year between 2016 and 2018. With this Washdyke airshed in mind, as an example, let's move to part B of this briefing. So there are many sources of dust which can create issues either when there are strong winds or an activity that moves dust into the air. Quarrying is one example, with several quarrying activities that can generate different amounts of dust, with the potential to cause adverse effects on neighbouring properties. The distance dust particles travel depends on how large they are, how dry they are, and how strong the winds are. Larger particles are more likely to affect visibility and amenity, like settling on surfaces or creating visible dust. Smaller particles can stay in the air longer and are more closely linked to potential health effects, particularly with repeated exposure. The impacts of dust on amenity and public health are an ongoing concern for our communities, especially for those in residential areas around Christchurch quarry zones. I'll now pass on to Tom to continue on.
Kia ora tātou. Yes, so communities in Yaltus and the surrounding northwest areas of Christchurch have been raising concerns around dust for a long time, for several years. Those concerns have generally related to dust on homes and properties, air quality, health, amenity value, etc. The Regional Council has responded to this in a number of different ways, including compliance investigations, site inspection, updated consent conditions, monitoring requirements, engagement with the industry, as well as the affected communities. Next slide, please, Miranda. Thank you. So there's already been a significant amount of work done in this space to date in response to these concerns. So since 2016, this has included air quality monitoring around Yaltus quarries, monitoring of dust samples inside homes, monitoring through a moat study, more recent best practice and technical assessment work also. The purpose of that work has been to better understand where dust is coming from, how it moves through the area, what potential health and amenity effects are, and what monitoring or management approaches might be appropriate in response. Despite all of this, however, there is still no universally accepted evidence base on the nature or scale of the dust impacts, and it remains an ongoing issue of concern for the community in northwest Christchurch. The key issue is not that no work has been done to date. A significant amount of work has been done in response to complaints. The issue is that there's still differing views about what data from previous investigation shows, whether the right things have been monitored, whether monitoring has occurred in the right place, and whether the results are trusted by the community or others. Concerns have also been raised about the ability of separate quarry-related dusts, to separate the understanding of quarry-related dust to background levels of dust. You'll hear anecdotally, like Canterbury can be a dusty place, especially in a prevailing nor'wester. So while previous investigations have provided some useful information, they have not resolved the level of concern or created a shared understanding between community, industry, and council. Can you go to the next slide, please? So, in response to those ongoing concerns and that lack of kind of a shared evidence base or understanding, the Strategy and Policy Committee last year asked staff to prepare a detailed scope, including costs and benefits, for a staged dust monitoring program for northwest Christchurch. The committee requested advice on measuring localised background levels of dust in residential areas through both a short-term and long-term program. Staff have now progressed this detailed scoping work to support that direction. Please. So, what is the work that's been undertaken to date? The scoping work has looked at what staged monitoring program would involve, including technical options, costs, practical feasibility, data quality, maintenance requirements, and the implications of a short versus long-term program. Staff have engaged with local residents and communities, particularly in identifying monitoring locations and understanding whether proposed sites would be trusted by the community. This included through mail drops, emails via our dust mailing list, and then the validation of sites through site visits. There's also been discussions with quarry operators and industry representatives about monitoring approaches, access to data, data sharing, and the practical implementation issues associated with all of those things. The key point here is that a monitoring program or a proposed monitoring program isn't just a technical exercise. For it to be useful, the process needs to build confidence in the results. Next slide, please. So this map, just for a bit of context, shows the wider quarry context around Christchurch. The key point is that the issue we are discussing sits within a broader network of quarries across the city, with a particular concentration in the northwest. If we were to monitor all of these areas, the scale of a potential dust monitoring program would be huge. The cost would be significant. If monitoring was to go ahead, there's a strong case for selecting a priority area, and staff have undertaken to do this and are proposing Yalthurst, largely due to the history of complaints associated with that area. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So having set that context, the proposed direction is to seek the Strategy and Policy Committee's view on the 17th of June about whether a staged monitoring approach should be included as a part of long-term plan deliberations. Subject to the committee's direction, the next step would be to undertake further community engagement, progress detailed planning, consider staged establishment of the monitoring program, including the funding process. In parallel, staff would continue engagement with quarry operators on access to monitoring data, finalising best practice quarry guidance, developing a quarry-specific addendum to pre-application consent guidance, and continuing that wider community communication about dust management. A key point is that we would seek that there would be a level of community acceptance of the results from any future monitoring program, as that has been one of the key issues in the past. So the bottom line is that there's been a significant amount of work undertaken to date and monitoring over several years, but this hasn't resolved community concern or created that shared evidence base or understanding. So a staged monitoring program would give council a more structured way to understand background levels of dust, improve confidence in the evidence, and support future decision making around quarry-related dust management. The decision that we would be seeking, or direction we would be seeking from the committee, is not to solve the dust issue immediately. It is to confirm whether council wants this work progressed or considered through the LTP. I'll probably leave it there and happy to take any partai.
Kia ora team, thanks for that. If you leave that last slide up. Just note, so we'll go to 245, noting what's planned here, that it is going to the S&P committee on the 17th, and is regarding the dust monitoring approach and what can be done in the future. So just knowing that, and we just keep referring back to that. But our first question is to Nick and then to Ashley.
Thanks, team. Can you just go back to the slide with the graph on it, please? The equality trends 2000 to 2025. Great to see a graph like this going in the right direction. We don't always achieve this at Environment Canterbury, and my question relates to how we achieved this. I was staff in the compliance team involved in this project, and I understand Councillor Scott may have been a champion of the project as well. Excuse me, must be a bit of dust still around. So can you please explain for those of us who weren't part of this, who might be newer, the role that the compliance approach played in this, the banning of the open fires, regulating for improved burner qualities, and getting these results? Because he touched on it, but I think it's a really salutary lesson to celebrate our success here.
I might ask Paul to come and answer this question.
Kia ora, through the chair. Yeah, a good question, Councillor. A little bit before my time as well, but certainly there was a dedicated compliance approach to the clean heat replacement programme back then. And I think it's fair to say that the compliance approach assisted with the trend. What did also happen, that there was many unfortunate things that happened during the earthquake. But one of the things that did happen during the earthquake is a lot of the fires or the chimneys were unusable. and that assisted significantly in the reduction of the air quality, well, improved the air quality as well. So there was a number of factors at the time, but there was a dedicated clean heat replacement compliance approach in those days.
Thank you. Do we still have that dedicated clean heat compliance approach at the moment? Just looking at that Timaru trend, which is going the wrong way the last 4 years, and wondering if we've changed our approach.
So we still respond to dust and smoky chimneys as part of our incident response service. So we don't have a clean heat dedicated team, but that's part of our compliance approach. We do manage the clean heat subsidy. I think that's still correct. So that's part of what we do. So we still have officers, I think around about 5 officers that are compliance monitoring or incident response officers, but focus in dust, odour and the chimney, the smoky chimney sort of work. So we still have dedicated officers for that work.
Kia ora, Nick. Thanks for that. Ashley?
So I realise that this briefing is mainly about dust because of what's coming next, but I just want to ask a question too about gases, hydrogen sulfide, which I know there have been questions about from Bromley residents recently from the sewage treatment. Where does that fit in? Is that our responsibility or is it Te Whatu Ora's responsibility when there's spikes in hydrogen sulfide off the treatment plant?
Paul, this might be one for you to answer as well, given it's an odour question. Is that correct, Councillor Campbell?
So, question about, I know this is mostly about dust, but talking about gases and in particular hydrogen sulfide, which I know there have been complaints from the Bromley community about. I'm just wondering what's our responsibility in that and how do we work with Te Whatu Ora over that issue?
Yeah, we certainly do work with Te Whatu Ora over the issue of odour in Bromley, and that's been part of our response when did it start? My mind goes back a good number of months ago, for sure.
We're not talking about odour, we're talking about hydrogen sulfide. Yeah.
Yeah, hydrogen sulfide. Yeah, we've been working with Te Whatu Ora since the matters arose with the wastewater treatment plant, and that's a case of making sure that we're sharing our information with each other respectively. So we've got different regulatory functions, and ours is obviously in relation to the effects of hydrogen sulfide, which is odour beyond the boundary, as you'll know. So our job is to hold those consents. That the consent holders are following the terms of those consenting conditions, so there's no offensive odour beyond the boundary. That is work that continues to happen. It was a major issue with the treatment ponds at the time. That's since subsided, and as you know, the Christchurch City Council have invested in aerators as well on those wastewater treatment ponds. But that will continue to be a targeted, prioritised approach, and we've been very clear that we expect those matters to be resolved.
The questions have been not about general odour, but about the actual health effects of the particular gas, hydrogen sulfide, which they have documented and sent to both us and to Te Whatu Ora. So I'm just trying to find out when we're not talking about generalised odour, no matter what's causing it, but a particular gas causing particular documented health effects with particular documented spikes in that gas, what is our responsibility in terms of actual levels of that gas, not just odour, versus Te Whatu Ora's responsibility in terms of monitoring the health effects?
I believe the Christchurch City Council monitor the levels of hydrogen sulfate at the site, and that's part of the consent condition. And I'm a little bit out of my depth around the detail of this, but I know that that we would also closely look at that in terms of consent conditions and science understanding. But I'll need to come back to you with a little bit more detail. But suffice to say, there is still a very clear conversation with Te Whatu Ora around that and health impacts that we will have.
So a second, possibly easier question. In talking about dust around quarry sites, again, talking Bromley, Dion will know that when we go to the Bromley Community Liaison Group regarding the organics processing plant, every time there's an issue about dust somewhere in Bromley, which is outside the group's scope, but it gets raised the whole time. So I'm just wondering, in terms of air quality throughout Christchurch, are we focusing purely on quarries, or would it be a good idea to start looking at some of those industrial areas where there is rock, where there's stone, where there's landscaping supplies, things like that?
So the approach we've taken in Christchurch is to monitor in we've got 3 monitoring sites in Christchurch representing different sources. One is residential in St Albans, one is along a roadside in Riccarton Road, and the other in Woolston is a mixed industrial and home heating or residential area. So monitoring is expensive, and typically we only have one monitoring site in an airshed, focusing on the main source that we think is going to breach the national environmental standards. And Christchurch is a little bit different because Christchurch is so large and there are other possible sources, but we can't have a monitor in every single place where people might be exposed.
Just responded to your Bromley. I thought I think the community of Bromley are concerned about a number of things, whether it's dust and odour, and I think quite rightly so, need to engage with both council and regional councils over those matters. The meeting that you speak to is principally for the composting, but that's not to say there couldn't be other ways to engage with that community over the concerns, and that's something I have been thinking about.
Good, Ashley, thanks for those. And I think Paul will take away the hydrogen sulfide issue. Moving on, we have John Faulkner and then Megan.
Could you bring up slide 16, please? It's the Strategy and Policy Committee direction. And just reading on that, given the issue that we have with Bainans Road and the community are making complaints in regards to dust from gravel extraction, and it's neither, I'm not saying right or wrong, but is it something that we should consider monitoring to alleviate any concerns that the community may have, because gravel extraction within residential areas is going to be an ongoing thing, and it's not so much a question for presentation or staff, it's more a question for the council members.
Anything down? Anything?
Could I just chime in? So what we will bring to the Strategy and Policy Committee has a proposal around the way in which we can monitor dust in that area. That method or approach could be taken to other sites, and we'll talk to that on the 17th. My advice to council is the biggest barrier to doing that elsewhere is the cost. It's significant, and so if you wanted to monitor all areas or dusty areas, sure you could, but there's a significant cost barrier to that. And so the priority has been in this area because of the history of complaints, and that has been an ongoing issue which the council has asked us to address.
Kia ora, Tom. That's just it, and it could be put into the LTP if moving forward. Kia ora. Over to you, Megan.
So my first question is going to be slide 10, then jump to slide 6, the measure, and then back to the future of slide 8. So if we start with 10, my understanding is from what you said before is that carp's worse because carp's more finer molecules and can cause more damage or harm to people and human health. Is that correct?
The carp has a lower concentration, which indicates the health impacts, yes.
Look, this is not a good news story. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. So if you look at the top there, Wash Dyke, they've, in the last 4 years, 0 to 2, Timaru, 23 to 36, Kaipoi, 28 to 39. This is tracking worse, so it's not a good news story. And for me, I then want to know, well, what are we doing? What is our current work program so that we actually can meet those national targets? And then from that, so what are we doing? And then back to 6 is our performance measure, just thinking forward to the long-term plan, is that performance measure age enough to indicate to us and give us comfort that we're tracking in the right direction?
The slide that we had with the table for the last 5 years just focuses on the year by year. For the long-term plan, the trend is done by taking out the impact of the weather, what makes those numbers change from year to year. It really depends on the winter weather. The number of days PM 2.5 exceed changes depending on how long the frosts, when they start, how long they go on for, when they finish. So it really depends on the type of winter weather. For the long-term plan, we take that out and we look at the trend, and that is decreasing over the last 10 years. So the long-term plan shows that it's reporting against the long-term plan. It's showing the work that we have been doing, are continuing to do, focusing on home heating, is it's still working, but it is slowing down, and it is good to pay attention to those changes in the last years. Last year in particular, only in our region there were higher days of exceedance. In other regions of New Zealand, it wasn't such a bad air quality story, but for Canterbury there were more days. It is just a variation from year to year.
So how does it understand that table? It shows over the last 5 years things are getting worse, not better, from the thing that can harm people the most, which is carp. I'm still really confused. Why then do we have this green? So carp's worse.
Sorry, through you, Chair. So carp up there is the Canterbury Year Regional Plan, and so and you are dead right. As in, we have made good progress in a lot of areas with regard to meeting the national requirements in the NZAC on the left-hand side there in PM10. However, the targets that were also set by this council through the Air Regional Plan were also included PM2.5, and progress hasn't been as good there. And so there is still, these are some of the challenges that we've got in front of us, particularly around PM 2.5.
So does that mean that we set the targets wrong, or we're monitoring incorrectly? Because it does show that things are getting worse for that, right? Our own measure that we set, rather than the national standard.
The target is 2030 to have no exceedances of the PM 2.5 guideline. So we're heading in the right direction in Geraldine and Waimeri and Wash Dyke. Got a wee way to go in Ashburton. Things are improving. It's hard to see that when you're looking at 5 years, but they are improving over time. I guess another thing to consider is the World Health Organization guidelines, which are even stricter than these. And so the numbers are even higher when you consider those guidelines. So we're heading in the right direction. We just have to keep going, focusing on smoke in the wintertime.
Then my last question then is about slide 8, the new RMA framework. And in that, so it talks about how we're going to have like the environmental limits will be set at a national level for human health and currently under the RMA, and ecology set at a regional level. And so I think for the most part, a number of councillors have been focusing probably on nitrates. For that kind of, it's easy to understand, well, what does that mean from a nitrate perspective? But what does it mean from an air perspective? And what I mean by that is when you've got central government setting the limits for human health and then regional councils setting the limits for ecology when it comes to dust, does that create any issues with the future planning framework?
Through you, Chair. I think from today's briefing, and we wanted to come to you ahead of the Strategy and Policy Committee because that's when we'll be talking about dust. And I acknowledge that this is the first time that we've talked to this council about the broader air work. So I wonder if we take this opportunity to say we'll come back to you with a fuller explanation, particularly of the efforts underway. We tried to cover it off on one slide there with a few bullets about how we're approaching PM 2.5 and 10, and that will give you a fuller picture. We'll make sure we have the right people in the room to talk to all that work and then what it means going forward.
Good. Thanks for the Cam. Ian, it's the last question.
Cool, thank you. Look, I'm listening to this conversation, and it seems to me from an equity perspective, if nothing else, we should introduce urban household environmental plans for every household in Christchurch. But my question is, and I imagine that'll cost them $10,000 to implement and to set up, and they'll be audited every 6 weeks, especially through the winter. But my question is, are we monitoring other airborne pollutants like microplastics and things like that? I'm told by learned colleagues and my children and grandchildren that I should be more worried about microplastics than I should be dust. And because I am depressingly by far the oldest person in the room, Canterbury is nowhere near as dusty as it used to be when I was a young fella. I can tell you that with certainty.
So we focus on the national environmental standards, which are for particles and gases, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone. We are currently working with the University of Canterbury. There are a couple of students looking into microplastics on the filters that we are collecting. Don't know a lot of details about that project as yet, but we are working with the university and we'll know more in time.
Good. I'll let the ex-air portfolio lead have the last question. He's been putting his hand up for the last half hour. Peter Scott.
Been systematically ignored the whole time, actually. I think one of the opportunities here is the same opportunity that was had in Timaru, where they moved the wash dock station. Is there a possibility of moving to better capture some of the data that Ashley was talking about? And you could take Waimatis and Geraldines out of South Canterbury and you can put them anywhere you like because they've met the threshold on PM10 anyway.
Through you, Chair. We'll come back with further advice on that. I think the question was pertaining to, can you move some of these monitoring stations in airsheds where we've seen good improvement to other areas where we want to see what's happening. We'll come back with further advice on that.
Kia ora team, thank you for the presentation. As we know, you're coming back on June the 17th. Any questions for who didn't get to ask, please send them to Paul through governance as well. And then we'll get back to you. On that note, it's 2:45. We'll have a 5-minute break and then we'll set up for a piece.
Plan Change 8 to provide councillors time to deep dive into the Section 32 and process requirements for progressing Plan Change 8. We've got Amy, Lisa and Zella at the table, and also Philip, who obviously will be providing advice as well. I understand that you want to take this session in 3 parts. There's a couple of slides in each part, then break for questions, and then go into the next section, questions, next section, questions, and then we'll be done. Sound good? Excellent. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And we've just actually realised that we haven't got the slides up, so we're going to have to. Hopefully, there's somebody that can help us find the slides. Anyway, thank you, Chair. I'm Lisa Jenkins. I'm the planning manager here. I've got with me Zella Smith, principal advisor. I've got Jackie Todd, who's a planning consultant, and Phil Moore, who's our legal counsel. We're here today to talk about Plan Change 8. We briefed you last month after we received confirmation from the Minister that we have the ability to notify Plan Change 8 should you decide to. And we're wanting to brief you today on the things that you have to have particular regard to in making that decision. And also, along the way, sort of recap you on the process that Plan Change 8 has taken. Plan Change 8 was initiated to address specific concerns in the plan that were real problems. The plan change has been developed to create a more enabling pathway for changes of use of water, for the interception of groundwater, and for the development of wetlands. So to date, we've invested around $380,000 in Plan Change 8, and we're here to make sure that should you progress and continue to invest in Plan Change 8, that the decisions you make are robust and that the process is protected. Plan Change 8 has followed a really robust process to date, including some significant consultation with stakeholders along the way and with partners. And Jackie's going to walk you through how that has all been documented within the Section 32 report. So we'll run you through the options for notification as well, and include in that sort of run through the differences between the freshwater planning process and the Schedule 1 hearings process. This is a workshop, so we want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and discussion as we go through. But there's still actually quite a lot of information, so it's not just going to be a couple of slides, unfortunately. It's going to be quite a number of slides, but we'll try and rip through them really quickly and make sure that there's plenty of time for questions as we go. So I'm just going to go ahead and pass over to Zella. And we don't have our slides yet.
Great, thank you. So if you've got the papers in front of you, you'll see the first slide after the council workshop slide says the framing of the presentation. So basically
Is somebody coming down to get the slides working? Okay, cool, because I imagine there'll be people online that would want to see the presentation as well, but continue on anyway.
Should we try over here, or are you guys sorting it over there? Okay.
Just carry on with the presentation, and
so
the slides will catch up.
Framing of the presentation, which just runs through the purpose, previous decisions, previous updates, status of the presentation. The key thing to note from that slide is that council will be required to make 2 key decisions in the future with some permutations that sit underneath that. Next slide is about the purpose of today's briefing in a bit more detail, and as Lisa said, we have received our exemption, which enables us to progress Plan Change 8, and we are here to talk about the necessary information to assist you in making your key decisions, which are whether you publicly notify the plan change or not, and which planning process to use. And as Lisa said, we're going to recap the proposed plan changes and the timeline, give you an overview of the Section 32 report, and the notification and options for the hearing process. So the first part of this is a recap. It's going to take about 10 minutes, probably just run through the background and purpose, the timeline and the benefits and disadvantages of proceeding. That is stuff that you've heard before, so we will pause for questions at the end of it, but probably the more exciting stuff is yet to come. Okay, so PC8 was started by the previous council. It's a collective term for changes to 3 regional plans, the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan, the Hurunui-Wairau River Regional Plan, and the Waipara Catchment Environmental Flow and Allocation Regional Plan. It addresses specific issues which have been identified as those plans have been implemented. It was initially focused on the taken use of water, which we call Part A, but the scope's expanded as it developed to include wetland construction, which we call Part B, and restrictions on agricultural intensification. The restrictions on agricultural intensification part subsequently been removed from the plan change on advice that that wouldn't meet exemption criteria. So the bits in front of you are Part A, taken use of water, and Part B, wetland construction. The overarching purpose of the plan change is to resolve unintended obstacles and regulatory hurdles in the existing planning framework, specifically related to the taken use of water and the construction of wetlands. Okay, so as I said before, Plan Change 8 has 2 parts. Part A, the taken use of water, and Part B, wetland construction. So Part A addresses issues arising from coupling the taken use rules that can constrain infrastructure development and prevent people from changing their use of water in some catchments. The way that it tries to address this issue is by introducing policies and rules to enable the interception of groundwater for infrastructure, for example, stormwater retention basins, wetlands, or the temporary interception of groundwater for bridge building and maintenance. And it provides a consent pathway for existing consent holders to change or add water uses, for example, irrigation of pasture to dairy shed washdown, or irrigation of orchards, for change from industrial use to commercial use, such as hot pools. But within that, water bottling is specifically prohibited. Some other examples of what the change in use might enable are things like an existing quarry needing more water for dust suppression, or councils developing green fields and changing from sports fields or park irrigation to community drinking water supply or wetlands. Another thing that it could do is enable micro-hydro use on irrigation consents. Now, the interception of groundwater rules would cover District Council stormwater treatment wetlands. This gets a little bit confusing when we talk about Part B, which is the wetland construction rule. But the wetland construction rules do not apply to stormwater wetlands because those things need more control than other types of wetlands. So the 2 parts have different purposes. The wetland infrastructure part is to remove regulatory barriers for infrastructure, whereas the wetlands part is to reduce costs associated with the construction of some wetlands, such as wetlands on farms, wetlands for aesthetic purposes, but excluding wastewater and stormwater wetlands, and provides a bespoke permitted activity rule for wetland construction activities. And where wetland construction doesn't meet that rule, a non-notified consent pathway. So we are here at the blue arrow. It's May 2026, where we're talking you through the draft Section 32 report and the planning process, or actually it's June now, missed it by a day or 2. But you can see through here that the development over the course of time. Right, a little bit on the pros and cons, or the advantages and disadvantages of proceeding with Plan Change 8. Plan Change 8 makes it easier for people to do the right thing. It supports the work of some of our key stakeholders and removes restrictions on important infrastructure proposals that are prohibited under existing planning provisions, including projects making rail and road network more resilient and supporting housing development. Well, we can't give you a whole lot of examples on these kinds of things because we know that they're prohibited, therefore people can't apply. So we can't tell you what's not happening because of it. But we do know that as when these rules kind of hit, we had people who had to withdraw, for example, the Kiwi Rail, or just put things on hold, for example, the Kiwi Rail Bridge, which is waiting to see what happens with this. Both parts of the plan change are enabling, and the benefits of the new provisions are likely to be achieved sooner through this plan change process than through waiting for the RM reform process. The proposed changes make the existing plans more consistent with the goals of the resource management reform by removing regulation that unnecessarily impedes growth. That's one reason why we were granted the exemption to be able to proceed to notification.
But additionally, we do provide for environmental enhancement within this as well. The disadvantages of proceeding are the cost of modifying a plan, which may have a limited lifespan. It's not clear exactly how long RM reform will take and how long we'll have to keep the land and water plan ticking over. And the time and cost to submitters, people who are engaged in this process are already engaged widely in resource management reform, and this is another thing that they have to deal with. Okay, so just to reiterate, you're going to have two key decisions to come, whether to proceed with the plan change and which hearing process to use. We intend to bring these decisions to you at the council meeting on the 24th of June, but we're going to go through some of the things you need to consider when making these decisions on the rest of this afternoon. Does anyone have questions at this point?
Councillor Faulkner and then Councillor Mackay.
Just going back to the disadvantages, are you able to clarify that or expand on what the actual cost of the disadvantages would be?
We estimate that from notification to decision, PC8 could cost between $600,000 to $1 million, but that is very much an estimation because it does depend on the level of involvement from the community within the process. That's probably as much detail as I can provide on that.
Megan.
These are all questions I had listed for slide 7, but if you think they're actually better off answered later, then fine. I'm happy with that. What I've been hearing, and I just need a couple of levels of high-level comfort on a couple of the big questions here when we're looking at Part A, the take and use. So when we're talking about an over-allocated catchment, I know people have different interpretations of over-allocation, and for me, I'm just using a common sense approach, which is we're taking out too much water. That's how I interpret it. And if that's the case, then I guess for me, in a real basic sense, it's just asking, does this plan change give anyone the ability to take more water and then just use it for a different purpose, take more water or same water for a different purpose? And also, if it's over allocated, does that mean that we want it to be, pull that back so it's not over allocated? And therefore, does this change mean that water that might otherwise have been stopped being used can now keep being used? Is that quite logical?
Yes, I understand the questions, and I think we'll just answer them now so we don't forget when we get into the detail. First question, no, this plan change wouldn't allow anyone to take more water than previously. Actually, sorry, I'll start with the change. And are you talking about the change in use provisions or the whole plan change?
At the highest level, because, it's easy. People who are in RMA, we jump into the detail, and I'm trying to bring it back up to the more macro level.
The conditions that have been proposed in the draft plan are reasonably stringent to ensure that that doesn't happen. So for change in use, which is the main one, I think the conditions would only allow people to take within the limits of existing consents. So no more water could be taken than is already consented. I'll go to your second question, and then you might need to remind me if there was another question. In terms of our over-allocation, you're right, there's several different meanings of that in planning speak. One is simply over a limit. So where a limit is specified, say for a groundwater aquifer or for a river, although that's more a rate of take, if a number has been set as to what the allocation is from that water body, over-allocation is over that limit. The second one, which hasn't been implemented in Canterbury yet, is a national policy statement term, which is more about the state of the water body, and that's where, say, water quality parameters would indicate that the water body is over its sort of capacity, if you like. And Canterbury, through all these various stops and other things that have happened along the way, ECAN has not yet been able to implement those provisions. So when we talk about over-allocated here, we are talking about the Canterbury, in the context of Canterbury over-allocation at the moment, which is over a limit or over a number. Does that?
That's really helpful because people's usual understanding of what over allocation means is we're taking out too much water and we're going to end up with no water. You're clearly saying that is not the interpretation here. It's where we've set a limit, so that's helpful. And then my very last question would mean, well, if we are, well, assuming that we had the limits right to start with, assuming it was a perfect rule framework, then, and then we're trying to get to a point where we're no longer over allocated, then would this change mean that water that would stop being used can now be used, that would otherwise have been stopped?
Not necessarily. So it's not water that would be stopped being used. So the water can continue to be used for the thing that it's been consented for. In some instances where that use is no longer viable, people might want to change that use, and so yes, that would be continued to be used where it may have otherwise stopped. But I think, if we're talking kind of changing from irrigation to dairy shed wash down, it's not something that would have stopped. Yeah.
Councillor Robinson.
Mine's a bit of a high-level question as well, but on face value, if someone had an allocation and they've only been using it for, say, 80% of their allocation, but knowing that this is coming and that it triggers that 5-year rule, and someone went about and actually started using that final 20%, does that sort of change what's going on here or the assessment of effects?
I'll pick that up. So the 5-year rule piece that you're referring to, I think I understand that to mean a consent lapsing if it's unused after a 5-year period, or the council's ability to cancel a permit unused after 5 years. That's binary in the sense of whether a permit is used or not. It either has or it hasn't. It doesn't delve down to the level of detail of has all of the permitted use been used. So as long as at a really brutal end of the spectrum 1% has been used, the consent's been given effect to and couldn't then lapse. It would have to be the entirety of a permit unused for 5 years or a consent never given effect to for that to apply.
Well, the reason I ask is that when we look at environmental effects now, that's based on a model of allocated water, not the actual use of the water. So that's the reason. So my second question is, it's probably jumping the gun because it talks about the actual assessment, but it acknowledges that there might be some environmental or allocation risks going forward. But where it specifically has assessed cumulative effects, have you looked at, I guess, the assessment of multiple consent holders utilising this pathway in the fully allocated catchment, and in particular, effects associated with taking away Part C for intensification?
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand. I wonder if I go back a step first too, just to add to what Philip has clarified. There's another 5-year clause which is built into these rules, which is that you can only apply to change use if the existing water permit has been exercised within the previous 5 years. So it doesn't fully address what you're raising, but so if the water permit's not been exercised in the last 5 years, can't apply to change the use. So that's just trying to avoid unused consent sitting there suddenly being utilised. And then there's also policy guidance that limits the amount of water that would be allocated to the change in use going forward, and it's the lesser of 3 things. And one of those things looks at actual use data over the past 10 years, and recognising these things will be subject to submissions. But the starting point for the 10 years was to try and avoid those sort of things that we do see when plan changes are coming in, where someone might use their consent to try and up how much water they're entitled to change their use of, so averaging over 10 years.
Disregarding the volume then, I guess, has intensification of, say, dairy farming been considered in this assessment?
There's, yes, in a way that we considered the existing rules like how do the existing rules interact with these rules? So while this might enable a change of use from a orchard to a dairy farm because you could change the use of water, there's a whole other rule framework that wraps around that in terms of nutrient management that puts other types of restrictions on that process. So it's the interrelationship between our whole framework, which is why this is a targeted plan change and not a full plan review.
Okay, if we've got any further questions on the recap, Councillor or Gerard?
That's based on our consent allocation, it's, isn't it, rather than actual effects. So when we have a land use like, say, a dairy farm has allocated the amount of water that would be, say, for what Hamilton would use, but then it doesn't use it. It's got that consent under the water take from the water entity, but in reality, if we change the land use to, say, a data centre, which is a continuous use, so that's a sort of a set amount, and it's sort of like, I just think the pattern of use might be quite different, and how, and whether how well does the planning framework deal with such a significant type of different land use, water take, and I'm trying to think. Sorry, it's not a very clear question, but I'm just trying to make that how would water companies cope with these major change in activities and water use.
These provisions are predominantly related to an individual consent holder who has an individual consent, not something like an irrigation company. If they wanted to, they could go through the same process, but it would be up to them to manage the rates and volumes within what was considered an efficient use for the water uses that they were requesting to do. And again, we would still have you can't have any more water than is already being used over the past however long it was kind of thing. So you could get differences in time, like they might use the same amount all day, whereas a dairy farm would use a certain amount during a certain period, September to June, May or whatever. But we're still limited by the volumes that were already addressed in there.
Yes, because the data centre would use it throughout the year.
Sarah?
Yeah, so it's sort of a different...
We need to move on to the next section. So we'll go through the Section 32 RMA piece. We'll do all of the slides and then we'll come to the end of that and we'll do questions. So if you've got a question halfway through, just signal and I'll write your name down. Andrea's first. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to just jump in and before Jackie gets into it and just reframe the Section 32. So the Section 32 is an overview of the process that we've taken so far to do the analysis, and it sort of sets out all of the analysis that we've done to get to this point. The plan change purpose is to address the barriers in the framework to use water and to constructing. We've tried to be around how we, so we've as address those water coming used, making sure that we're not exacerbating a problem that already exists. So the rules have been very carefully crafted to prevent additional use where we can, whilst also achieving the purpose of this plan change, which is to enable the change of use so that we can get better uses of the water that's allocated. That's really what's driving this. So I just wanted to reframe that before passing on to Jackie, and I'll also just acknowledge that Jackie's recovering from a cold, so her voice might just need a rest. But I'll pass on to you now.
Kia ora, and thank you. So I'm going to talk about Section 32 of the Resource Management Act and the report that was prepared in accordance with that section. It's a big report, it's 80-odd pages plus appendices, so I'm just going to give an overview and then leave plenty of time for questions. So the reason that we're talking to you about it is partly because it's when you make the decision on whether to proceed with the plan change and to notify, you must have particular regard to the evaluation that's in the Section 32 report. And you must also have particular regard to advice that's been received from relevant iwi authorities, and that's in accordance with Clause 4A. And that advice and the response to it is summarised in the Section 32 report, and I'll come back to that in a bit more detail. Particular regard, which Philip is welcome to jump in on, that means that councillors that you are familiar with the information that's in the report and that you've given genuine thought and attention to it. And so when we come back to you on the 24th of June, there'll be a paper that takes into account all of these considerations. But this workshop is an opportunity for us to talk you through the Section 32 report so that you become familiar with it. You can ask questions so that you can have particular regard to it when making those decisions later in the month. Yep. So as well as something you need to have particular regard to, Section 32 reports are really important, and they're something that as a planner I refer back to a lot in my day-to-day work. They're important because they provide transparency for the public and decision makers, and they explain the rationale for the proposed new policies and rules. So the purpose of the Section 32 report at a really high level is to examine if the proposed plan change provisions, so the proposed policies and rules, are the most appropriate way to achieve the purpose of the plan change, or in this case purposes, because there's really 2 or 3 purposes of each part. So the Section 32 report needs to do that. It needs to include an assessment of the different options that could achieve that purpose, and I'll come back to that a little bit. And the bulk of the Section 32 report focuses on assessing the efficiency and effectiveness of the provisions, and that includes assessing the costs and benefits across 4 wellbeings. And the report must then summarise the reasons for deciding on the proposed provisions in the draft plan. Yep, and then I'll just go into a little bit more detail on that. So that efficiency and that evaluation in the Section 32 report needs to include quite a few things. They're all listed in Section 32. So as I've just said, it needs to include an assessment of the costs and benefits of the environmental, economic, social and cultural effects, and where practicable, quantify these. The report also needs to consider the risk of acting or not acting if there's an uncertainty or insufficient information. The report needs to be at a level of detail that's consistent with the scale and significance of the effects of the plan change. And as I've said, it needs to summarise all advice from iwi authorities, and that's in both Clause 3 and 4A consultation and the response to that advice. So the Section 32 report includes all of the required information, and as I said, it's a lengthy report. So we'll, actually, before we go on to the next one, is that slide 14? Yep, we'll just pause there for a moment. Before we go into the detail, I just thought I would take you through the contents of the Section 32 report and what's in each section, which I've got too many bits of paper here. Sorry, I've been logged out. Right. So there's 5 sections in the Section 32 report and appendices. Section 1 is just the introduction to the report. So it outlines the purpose of the report and what Section 32 requires. And then it introduces the plan change, what's in it, and the high-level reasons for the plan change. It also outlines the scope of the plan change, so it outlines why it's proposed to change 3 regional plans and not others. Section 2 then gives an overview of the development of the plan change from 2024 until now, and it includes a summary of the changes to the Resource Management Act that have occurred during that development. It also gives an overview of consultation, what consultation occurred and when, and which parties were consulted. Section 3 is a nice short section. It just provides the actual detail of the plan changes, so it just lists the policies and rules that are to be changed and the new policies, rules and definitions that are to be added. Section 4 evaluates the extent to which the purpose of the plan changes is the most appropriate way to achieve the purpose of the Act, so Part 2 of the Act, and that's a requirement of Section 32. And then Section 5 is the biggest and final section in the report, which is what we'll focus on, or what I'll focus on next. So that contains the evaluation of provisions that I've just talked about, and evaluates whether the proposed plan change is the most appropriate way to achieve the objectives, and then covers most of the requirements of Section 32. The evaluation includes a discussion on discounted options, reasonably practicable options that we then considered, and the efficiency and effectiveness evaluation, which includes that assessment of benefits and costs. And then Section 5 also includes details of the consultation, the feedback that was received, and the response to it. So we'll now move on to a bit of detail. So for this, we've divided it up. There's two parts of the plan change, if you recall. There's Part A, which relates to the take and use of water, and there's Part B that relates to wetlands. And then within Part A, there's a set of policies and rules to enable the interception of groundwater for infrastructure operation, and then a set of rules to enable the change in use of water. So before I get into the detail of the infrastructure rules, right back at the start of the development of the plan change, we considered a huge range of options, and they were discussed with staff from all over the council. They were tested a number of times internally with the plan change team. They were run past legal advisors. And initially, the thinking was that it would probably be most efficient and easiest to change existing rules, just give them a wee tweak to deal with the issues initially that came out of the AWA decision. But actually, it became obvious quite quickly that doing that would have the opposite effect. It would actually create a really broad plan change with the potential for unintended consequences. And so we quite quickly moved to looking at new sets of rules where we could have more targeted rules and perhaps manage the effects of these changes better, including some of the effects that have come up in questioning already today. So after discounting, tweaking the existing take and use rules in the plan for infrastructure, for the take and use rules as a whole, we considered three options: the status quo, which is your existing plan, so leaving things as they are, a single set of provisions for both infrastructure and change in water use. So that was a new set of policies and rules that tried to address all of the issues that had come up with the take and use. And the sorts of examples we had in front of us were the sorts of things that Zella's talked about. So wetlands that couldn't go ahead because they couldn't intercept groundwater, a bridge that couldn't avoid intercepting groundwater, farmers wanting to add dairy shed water to their irrigation permits. And what we found was it was really tricky to write one set of rules and address all the effects of that huge range of activities that it was intended to cover. So then that evolved to looking at two different sets of provisions, which is the preferred option that's been put in front of you. So a single set of provisions for infrastructure, because that just kept coming up as the most urgent example, I think, and then a separate set of provisions for change in use or adding an ancillary use. So it was quite an evolution. I think it went over 3 or 4 months and all sorts of drafting and testing to get to those three options. So that's where we landed, that a separate set of policies and rules for the interception of groundwater was assessed as the best option to achieve the purpose of the plan change while still managing effects. So it allowed us to put policies in place that very specifically guided when it would be appropriate to grant those consents, and then conditions in the rule that had to be met before infrastructure operation could be enabled. So in the assessment in the Section 32, as is usually the case, all of the options looked at have costs and benefits, but the chosen option was expected to result in the lowest costs and the greatest benefits. So moving on to, we'll stick with infrastructure and go into consultation. So feedback on this part of the plan change was generally supportive, both from iwi and all stakeholders actually, in fact very supportive from infrastructure providers, as you would imagine. So we've focused, because you have to have particular regard to it, we've focused on the advice from iwi in our presentation. So iwi expressed support for the concept, but did want to make sure that the effects of the proposal were minimised and managed to the fullest extent possible. They supported a recognition of adverse effects on Ngāi Tahu values and sites of significance, so that's something that's mentioned in the policy for this activity, but they did request that wording be quite strong and that those effects be avoided rather than managed, which was what was in the drafting for a time. They did have a concern about the range of activities that could be provided for by the rule, and that was echoed by a number of parties actually expressed that concern. And there was obviously some confusion about what the interception of groundwater was and what would be enabled. Moving on to how we responded to that. We were able to respond to quite a lot of this feedback. One of the main things we did is we added a definition for groundwater interception to better define what it covered and also to enable us to limit what it covered and minimise unintended adverse effects. And importantly, that definition makes it clear that it's just where groundwater is encountered. It's not where it's physically pumped and abstracted. So that definition is quite important to limit the scope of this rule. And then we made some other changes to tighten the policy guidance to restrict where that interception will be exempted from allocation limits, require that interception is minimised as far as possible, recognising that sometimes it's desirable as part of the functioning of the infrastructure, like wetlands, for example. And as I've talked to, we strengthened that requirement to avoid adverse effects on Ngāi Tahu values and sites of significance. In response to feedback from other parties, we expanded the permitted activity rule to include rail drainage as well as roads, and we expanded the rule to cover all road and rail networks, not just strategic ones. So the changes addressed most of the concerns raised, and the other changes that couldn't be addressed were largely because they went beyond the targeted scope of this part of the plan change. Moving on to change in water use. So as I've said, we did look at different ways of tweaking the existing rules, and some of those options included removing the prohibited activity status of the rules, changing the conditions of the existing rules. I think those are the key options we looked at actually, or separating the take and use rules, so having a separate rule for the take and a separate rule for the use. All of those options are very broad, and the potential for unintended consequences was concerning. And we felt that all of those options were too lenient for fully or over-allocated catchments, of which there are quite a few in Canterbury. And so that's where we moved to this bespoke set of policies and rules specifically for change in use or adding an ancillary use. And that's where we were able to add policy guidance and conditions that perhaps address some of the questions that were raised this morning. So policy guidance around the sorts of effects that would need to be managed if a consent is granted, and around how much water might be allocated to the consent when the use is changed. And I note that the rules for these are reasonably strict. They're a non-compliant activity, which is the strictest activity status you can have before you prohibit something. And so it's quite a stringent pathway. So it's not just a given that someone would apply to change their water and just get an amount of water without checking that it's reasonable and efficient and that it's not more than what's been taken and used in the past. So coming back to the conclusions in the Section 32 report, we do acknowledge the cultural costs of allowing the change in water use. That was certainly something that iwi gave us feedback on in consultation, and the potential for more water transfers if water use can be changed and then transferred to another site. However, as I've just kind of said, the preferred option allows the environmental and cultural costs to be minimised while still achieving the purpose of the plan change. The analysis found that there are a range of social and economic benefits of allowing a change in the use of water, and with the chosen option resulting in more benefits than the status quo, so more benefits than the current plan, and similar benefits to the other option considered, which was that much broader set of rules to cover all take and use issues. But this more bespoke set of rules allows more targeted management of effects. And then I think might move on to wetlands. No, sorry, feedback. I'm getting ahead of myself. So as we've discussed in briefings with you before, this part of the plan change received a large amount of feedback, both in support and opposition. And so again, focusing on the advice from mana whenua, there was opposition from most runanga to this proposal. There was a concern that water take and use should be considered together and that reuse should consider the needs of the source water body first. There was concern that allowing a change in water and then the associated site-to-site transfers is not consistent with mana whenua views or iwi management plans. They were concerned that the language used initially implies that all swaps are beneficial. And then there was some other concern about lack of guidance on consent duration, reliance on water use records, and lack of industry guidelines on efficient use for some uses of water. And then finally, water bottling came up as an issue, and there was a concern that water bottling wouldn't be well tested by the reasonable and efficient use test, and we were asked why there wasn't a rule prohibiting a change to water bottling. So moving on to the response, the provisions were changed substantially in response to Clause 3 feedback, and then again in response to the Clause 4A iwi feedback on the change in water use. And so some of the key changes we made, because there were a lot, was changing how the policies and rules work together to provide more guidance and discretion in the consent process. We added a condition to prevent a change from non-consumptive to consumptive use, to change that increase in actual use. We added a condition to prohibit a change to the use of water for water bottling. We changed that terminology to remove that suggestion that all changes in use are beneficial to the environment. And we made quite a few other wording changes for clarity. Where changes weren't made, it was largely because the purpose of the plan change couldn't be achieved, or the changes requested are outside the scope of the plan change. And that would include site-to-site transfers. That came up a lot in feedback. The ability to transfer a water permit to another site comes from the RMA and then from the regional plans, which then place restrictions on them. So this plan change isn't touching those provisions for transfers at all. Okay. I better keep moving. I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. So we'll move on to we'll move on to Part B, and then we'll go to questions at the end, I think, if that's okay. So Part B, wetlands. Again, we looked at various tweaks and realised that to be more enabling of wetlands, probably the most logical option was to pull have a bespoke set of rules that pulled all of the activities that are typically involved in wetland construction into one set of policies and rules. And so in addition to the existing plan or the status quo, we looked at a new set of rules with a permitted activity pathway and a new set of rules where resource consent would still be required, but as a controlled activity. A controlled activity consent has to be granted, and the matters for control are limited. So it's kind of intended to be the easiest, if you like, consent to obtain. However, what the Section 32 analysis found is that that controlled activity pathway probably doesn't really achieve the purpose of the plan change, which is to reduce the cost and regulatory barriers to wetland construction, and still require a resource consent. That cost is still there, the regulatory barriers are still there, and so it's pretty similar to the status quo and probably doesn't really achieve much. And so that's why the preferred option in the Section 32 is a new set of rules with a permitted activity pathway, and where resource consent is required, no public notification of that consent. So, just go back a bit. That's okay. You did. So that analysis found that wetlands do have a range of benefits, and introducing a rule framework specifically for wetland construction with a permitted activity pathway is an effective and efficient way to achieve the purpose. Sorry, you can go now. So feedback on wetland construction was generally supportive both from mana whenua and from all parties, actually. The feedback was more focused on details of the policies and the rules and particular conditions to manage the adverse effects. So there was a concern from iwi that the permitted activity rule could be too enabling and that could result in damaging effects, and they listed those. There was particular concerns about works, associated works in the bed of a river to construct a wetland that came up, and also a concern about the potential for constructed wetlands to be used as de facto storage dams. So use the wetland to put your water in and then effectively operate it like a storage dam and take that water back out again. And then there was a concern about effects on water quality, mainly during construction if there was a discharge of sediment from the constructed wetland. Yep. So we did make quite a few changes to address that. There were some minor changes to the definition of constructed wetland, bearing in mind that for the definition we have to be very careful not to conflict with any other provisions in the plan, any other definitions for wetlands in the RMA, and also the National Policy Statement and the National Environmental Standard. So that had to be fairly carefully considered. We did add some restrictions on activities within the beds of larger rivers to try and address those concerns. But I do acknowledge that the concern is still there that any activities at all can occur in any beds of rivers. We did add a condition to prevent wetlands being used to take water from a storage facility to address that concern about de facto storage dams. And we there was already a condition about discharges, but we strengthened it to manage the effects of discharges from to water bodies from wetland construction. So the changes did address most of the concerns raised, and again, similar for other parts of the plan change, where the changes weren't made, it was because the changes wouldn't achieve the purpose of the plan change, and so that's particularly in regard to that concern about activities in the beds of rivers. If we prohibit any wetland construction that is in the bed of a river, it would probably be back to the plan we've got now, where most wetlands would need a consent. So that concern sort of conflicted with the purpose of the provisions. Okay, that's the end of the section 32, which is good. So I'm happy to take questions if that's
absolutely.
How you want to go.
So I've got Councillor Davis, Campbell, Megan, Mackay, Mackenzie, then Gerard at this stage. Moody, anybody else? Councillor Ward? Okay, we'll start with that. Councillor Davis.
I'll start. You've covered so much. You've done a very thorough job. And the thing that jumped out at me was the water bottle thing, because all you say is bottling but not sale. And then I thought, Alpine Fault 8, what if we all of a sudden need to bottle water to survive? What do we do? And I just noticed that Waikato Regional Council does have a water shortage risk mitigation plan up there, and it says clearly with these risks, like natural disasters, we can do certain things. So I don't know if we need to future-proof anything like that in here, but we could be making a rod for our backs.
Good question. And the RMA and replacement legislation will squarely deal with this, in that there are emergency powers that would simply kick in and enable repurposing of water, for example, to be used to put into water bottles in the event of an emergency. Hard to hardwire protection in a plan in terms of thinking of all of the emergencies, and so there are those powers that would be available.
Fantastic, that's what I thought. Most of my questions are in wetland. You say the same or different temperatures going back in, you're allowed to do that, but why wouldn't we just say the same? I mean, we're leaving it very wide open here, and I know that with this groundwater thing, it's an 8-degree difference, because most groundwater is about 13 degrees, 14 degrees, and you're allowed 8. But I don't know if we really want to say the same or different temperature. You can think about that. The other one is, where did you get the 5 liters per second or 100 cumecs per day for the wetlands? Where did we get that amount of water from for this? It's quite specific, and I just wonder if we should not really be that specific.
I think that one's already in the plan. That's an existing rule. But I'd also say all of these are the sorts of issues that will come up in submissions and we will note your comments. Wetlands is the sort of thing that we do get a lot of people who are quite experienced in wetland design who will more than likely submit, and these are all things that can be considered and changed as part of that process.
Yeah, and that's the point, is that there's such good guidelines out there by Landcare, Darians, at everyone. Wouldn't we just say you must follow one of these guidelines?
We did look at that, and I've even been on some courses for those guidelines to better understand them. They're very hard to enforce because they can be quite broad, and so sometimes it's better to try and pull out the key aspects of the guidelines that then need to be monitored and enforced.
And you did that in 5.16a, page 16. But I was wondering if there's 60 different points you've got in there, and I wonder if you could put that into a table. It's page 16 of the 32, section 32 report. 60 different things that conditions are met, 60 conditions. And I'm wondering, could that just be a table for the punters to make it easier?
I'm sorry, what part of the section?
It's page 16 of your proposed PC8 land and water plan, and it's 5.160A, and it's conditions, provided these conditions are met for the wetlands. And
Sorry. Within the Section 32 report, we could definitely tabulate things. Within the plan itself, we're kind of constrained by the structure of the plan. And so while we could potentially do that, it would then probably mean that we'd need to put it into a schedule at the back of the plan, because the formatting would go absolutely haywire. It's a potential option. It's just not a particularly efficient one, given the structure that we're working within.
Councillor Campbell.
Okay, so my first question's just been answered. First of all, I want to say thank you. This is a really good briefing, and I'm actually following it, so that's an improvement. Page 20, where changes suggested by mana whenua were not made, it's because the purpose of the plan change could not be achieved, or changes requested are outside the scope of the plan change, including site-to-site transfers. Can you just clarify that a wee bit for me? The notes that I've written down are ability to transfer to another site through the RMA. Can you just flesh that out a wee bit for me?
Specifically in regard to the site-to-site transfers, we received a lot of feedback about concern about the potential for site-to-site transfers after the change in water use. And what I was just trying to clarify there is that we couldn't really, we haven't touched the site-to-site transfer provisions that are in the plan, which are actually quite strict in what they allow. So you can't change across a catchment, you can't change across an allocation zone, and in some over-allocated catchments in Canterbury, 50% of the water has to be surrendered if there's a transfer. So we didn't want to touch those because we don't want to open those up to become more lenient. So what I'm not sure if this fully answers your question, but what we're alluding to there is we didn't make any changes in direct regard to the concerns about transfers because they're not part of this plan change. That said, we did try and lock down the change in use policies and rules to make sure that people can't get more water or take more water and then transfer it.
Councillor Megan Mackay.
Kia ora. I just wanted to say first, the Section 32A report, AA report, really good. So I thought it did a really good job in explaining position. Some time ago, earlier in the May, the chair and I went and met with Ngāi Hudidi, and at that stage they said what would be really helpful for us from Plan Change 8 is first of all to understand the Section 32A analysis, and I think that's been shared. But actually they said what would be helpful is to know what was said, what we asked for, what changed, what was listened to, like just a quick table. And I thought, oh, well, I'm reading Section 32A, I can probably do that myself. And I started to do it, and then I thought, I don't want to do this. And so at that time, we kind of made a commitment that we might look into doing something really simple to go, and I think the Section 32A does a really good basis to just go, these are the points that weren't quite given effect to, but this is how we've dealt with it. I mean, I'm really quite comfortable with how it's been explained. And I do also note that we had that conversation on the 11th of May, and since then, the direction from the Mayoral Forum of the Regional Spatial Planning Committee actually having mana whenua voice and say in there might actually remove a lot of that concern in any event, because the RMA framework is moving away from decisions at that consent level and up at the front loading at the plan making stage. And I think that this region saying, well, even though iwi don't have a power to appoint to those committees, but we're going to do it anyway, is a really clear signal that mana whenua voice will still be included. Because what I've certainly heard when I've gone out and tried to talk and engage on Plan Change 8 is the taken use that some uses are perfectly fine, but there are some uses that are not fine. And when I read through paragraph 176 in particular that says we're going to actually prohibit water bottling, things have been dealt with, like systematically dealt with. So that is my long-winded way of saying a table or a very simple table, something really simple would be helpful if I could get help in getting that together. But in any event, I just need to check in with them one more time because after Friday, it might have changed again. Yep.
We can absolutely provide that.
Councillor Mackenzie.
Look, if I can just make a comment and then ask a question, but my comment is that I support tough provisions on transfer of take points, and I've always thought that enabling transfer of take, because of the implications for the effect on other people's take points, it's fraught with problems, and it infers a degree of ownership of the consent, which I think is inappropriate in New Zealand's law setting. But I do support the flexible approach to taking use, to being able to change use. And my question really is, in your Section 32 analysis, when you were considering the various options, did you consider, and I asked this question of Andrew Parrish when he was working here, and I'm not sure I ever got a straight answer from it, but whether in fact it was part of the problem, part of our problem with the change of use is that we're too, what's the word, polite word for anal retentive, about considering what is a change of use. So, you've consistently in this presentation talked about a change from orchards to dairy to orchards. Well, actually, if you're irrigating crops, what's the difference? I mean, is that really a change of use? And you also talk about washdown water. Well, if my irrigation water washes down my dairy shed and then goes out through my irrigator, is that a change in use? And I would argue, and probably if somebody suggested it was, I would argue through whatever court processes I needed to say yes, it's not a change of use. But so yeah, question 32, did you consider whether we've just been too prescriptive in our definition of what is a change of use in the first place? I mean, clearly, if you're going from wool scouring to water bottling, that is a significant change of use. I'm not questioning that, but I'm talking about more the subtle changes.
We did consider it, and we did talk about it, and Zella and I both spent a considerable time in consents, and I would agree with you, the criteria around change of use is fairly stringent. We didn't go too far down the path of trying to define change in use, and I understand what you're saying, but I think it's a practice and that's been formed over a very long time at ECAN, and I think it would be quite challenging to change that via this plan change. And I think off the top of my head, a definition for change in use would be pretty challenging to find that line. So we didn't go too far down the path of considering an option of addressing the scope of what a change in use or what is considered to be a change of use and what isn't.
So what are the rules? What are the rules and regulations, or where is it in the plan that you've formed your definition of what is a change of use, where other people might challenge that?
I'm going to jump in here. There's an inconvenient legal overlay at play around what a use is, and the way the courts interpret the scope of the use of a permit is on a consent by consent basis and often informed by the scope of the application originally lodged. So you might see on its face a resource consent for irrigation, but when you read the application, it's precise about irrigation of a particular crop on a particular paddock. The court will take a more stringent view on changing that use to something than they might a consent that is, again, on its face, irrigation with no restraint in the underlying application documents. So the challenge that arises from a regulatory perspective is needing to understand each and every time what the scope of the use is on an individual permit relative to a change in use. And that's where there's inefficiency introduced into the system, because every consent is effectively unique relative to its application. What this change is trying to do is to provide a pathway through taking away the focus from the underlying permit to a planning response to say you can change, you need to meet some requirements, but it's to avoid that individual consent by consent interpretation exercise that's required.
Look, that's a really good explanation, because you're right. I've got a few farms and a few consents for irrigation purposes, and they all have a slightly different use purpose. So actually being able to take away that complexity is really cool. Yeah.
Councillor Gerard.
I've got two issues. I guess it's about, again, allocation.
Stand by, Councillor Gerard. Councillor Scott, did you have a question? No. You don't want to ask your question? Ask your question now, and then you can go.
So, Philip, just following on from what Ian McKenzie was saying regarding the dairy consent, one being irrigation, and there's a distinction between that and washdown. So if you look at it from a farming perspective, it's like a holistic use of the water on your farm. Is the separation because of volume?
I think it's actually more to do with efficiency. So when we're looking at a consent for a particular use, we've got to make a call around whether or not that water is going to be used efficiently, and what's used efficiently on a dairy farm is going to be different to an apple orchard.
Thank you, Councillor Gerard, for letting that happen. Councillor Gerard.
Yeah, just back to the dairy farming versus data centres. I guess I've got two things. The point I'm trying to make is that dairy farms need their water the most during a critical drought period. So it may be a prolonged drought, and Canterbury's water is at its stress levels. But if you think of a bath, we've got the over-allocation, and some of that bath is taken up by data centres, and that needs water every day, not just during the drought period. And so it's that, what land use. Yeah, it's sort of, it's because we've got that allocation, but the allocation's not fully used until we've got a drought.
I think there's a couple of things at play here. So our allocation limits are about the amount of water that partially was already allocated, so we just kind of added that up and called it an allocation block, and partially about what the environment can handle. And they don't pick winners. It's very much a first in, first served option, and then we try to manage the effects of that activity. And this plan change isn't going to change that at all. Long term, if the resource management reform allows us to, a regional conversation about winners might be appropriate, and having that discussion about water allocated to different activities where we could, in a bucket that then people could choose which bucket they take from, could occur. But it's not a function of this plan change, because that would really unpick the whole knitting of the way that we've done the planning. Is that about where you're heading?
Yeah, it's just something. And just on that, Councillor Gerard, the newer models of data centres that are around are called a closed loop. Just like your car with its radiator, it goes around and around and around and around, and they don't need to draw water all the time. So there are innovations.
Hopefully in time for us. Just as a comment, really, and it's quite a sad comment. I've done a lot of constructed wetlands, sort of mainly doing the roading ones where you have it to treat runoff from the roads, and you treat for heavy metals before discharge into waterways. But another wetland we were doing was on the Karamu stream, and that was in the bed, and it was under land management, and one of the guys said, go out and have a look, and the poor digger driver was hands in the air going, oh my God. There was thousands and thousands of elvers everywhere, and we had disturbed the bed and disturbed a whole, and it was something I'll never forget. And I think,
Can you ask
it's not a question. It's just, there's no compliance in there.
I've got other people who...
So it's just...
questions. So Councillor Moody, please.
Thank you. I support a simple table, please, of what's changed based on feedback. I've got 3 points. Number 2, I assume we'll vote on each part separately. So looking at part A, the sort of clawback provisions and the over-allocated catchment. So that was in some previous briefings, and it sounds like it's still there in terms of if it's in a catchment which is 50% of the water has to be surrendered if there's a transfer, you were saying, and some over-allocated catchments. Can you just talk a little more about this, or maybe point me to the part of the Section 32A report that talks to it as well, because that's the real number of it in terms of if it's over allocated, there's not enough water there. Well, I want to change from my orchard to a sheep farm. Let's pick on something else, and I can't. Okay, so that water might go back in the river, or now I can, so that water isn't getting back in the river. I'm curious about this point. That's the question. The water being surrendered, the clawback. Is there a clawback here?
So there's policy guidance for the change in use, which states, bearing in mind that as a non-compliant activity, the policy guidance is quite important to guiding the granting the consent or the decision on the consent. So the policy guidance states that the amount of water allocated needs to be the lesser of three things. One is the volume of water that's assessed as being reasonable and efficient, so making sure that whatever the new use is, the amount of water allocated isn't too much. The second one is a small clawback, which answers your question, 90% of the rate of previously consented rate of take. And the third one is a maximum annual or seasonal volume based on actual use over the past 10 years. So it's a very small clawback. It is there as policy guidance. I would stress that the 50% reduction I was talking about is the existing transfer provisions in the plan. It's not a part of this plan change. My point there was more that if the concern is that change in use would enable or encourage more site-to-site transfers, there are already some pretty strict limits in the plan. In my experience in consenting, those clawback provisions I don't think particularly result in a reduction in allocation in Canterbury. What they do is stop people doing what they might otherwise have done. And so based on, Zella and I both spent a lengthy time deciding consents. We've got a pretty good overview of the sorts of consent applications that came through Environment Canterbury for a fairly lengthy period of time, and it stops people transferring. They don't transfer and surrender 50%. They go, oh, I'm not going to transfer if I have to give up 50%. So I just want to stress, I don't think these rules or policies will necessarily result in much of a clawback. It was just there as a bit of a nice to have that we might be able to at least reduce a little bit of the amount of water allocated. I think clawing back over allocation in Canterbury is a much bigger problem that will need to be addressed in the next regional plan.
Thank you. Well, that's how we address big problems, though, one bite at a time. Like, how do you eat the elephant, right? And yeah, I support this individual consent by consent application process. That's how we manage consents and use of scarce resources under the RMA, isn't it? We might get to a permitted activity model from central government, but we're not there.
Be careful what you say with putting a position out there like that.
It's a workshop, aren't we? Meant to
talk it over. Don't want you to be predetermined in your views. That does raise me a question that I have around the planning framework that we're moving into. By 2028, if we aren't existing as a regional council and there's some other entities, who inherits these rules, or do they exist any further, or is there something else that needs to take over? And it kind of then lead into this next section, because that's about the money and time that this will take.
Yes, I don't think that there's a really clear answer to how the transition will actually work, but the plans that we'll have will stay in effect until the transition is complete and the new system takes over. But they're two different types of transition. So there's a transition around our governance, and then there's a transition for the resource management stuff. And the resource management stuff, we'll have our plans until we have the new plans, and then the new plans will take effect. For the governance and who's actually who's implementing those plans, that will change.
Yes.
At whatever time.
But I think what I'm saying is that in Canterbury, if we do break into two separate entities outside of the planning system that we've got that we're moving into, do those entities then both inherit the existing rules until they change them respectively?
Yes.
Okay. No, that's okay. Cool. Thank you. What we'll do is we'll move into this next section, if you can run through that, and then we'll do a general question wrap up at the end of it.
Excellent. So now we're going to talk about your decisions around notification and the hearing process. We've scheduled 40 minutes for that, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so when making your notification decision, you'll be considering whether part or all of PCH should use the freshwater planning process. I think I confused myself and everybody else in the room last time I spoke to you by indicating that you had to use part of the freshwater planning process for part of this. You don't. You have a choice, Schedule 1 or the freshwater planning process, so that you've got a full choice over which process that you choose to use there. You'll also be deciding what date notification will take effect and how long the submission period will be. Our recommendations will consider all of those things, the most appropriate option, considering the delivery, the cost, legal robustness, and natural justice. So just to make it clear, public notification is a formal step in the planning process. It's a chance for all stakeholders and interested parties to have their say on the proposal. So that's anyone, anywhere in the region and outside. Once notified, the proposed plan change rules will operate in parallel with the existing rules. So the existing Land and Water Regional Plan rules and the Plan Change 8 rules will both be in play. So that creates some complexity for our consenting and compliance teams, but they've done it before and they're really good at navigating through those processes. Conveniently, because these plan changes have been on our website for quite some time, those teams have had a good opportunity to look through and see what they might need to do. When we're looking at your notification options, you've got being able to notify both parts of the plan change. You could notify Part A or Part B, or you could decide not to notify any of it. So a range of options. So when you're choosing the planning process that you may wish to go through, we have the RMA Schedule 1 process, that's the traditional process, and the freshwater planning process. So both planning processes involve the same steps after public notification. There's a submission period, a hearing, decision, and appeals. In terms of time saving, the appeal rights is where the key time saving is. For example, Plan Change 7 took just over 4 years for a decision to fully operative. Plan Change 5 took about 1.5 years. If you go through the freshwater planning process, there's much more limited appeal rights, so that could narrow down that amount of time. The other area where things differ is in terms of the ability for council to appoint a hearings panel. So if you use the freshwater planning process, the freshwater commissioner appoints the hearing panel, including members nominated by council and tangata whenua. If you use the Schedule 1 process, you get to fully appoint the hearing panel. So the kind of touched on that, alluded to that in my previous conversation, but the key benefits is your control over the process and hearing panel appointments if you use the Schedule 1 process, but the drawback is that the process is generally longer. Freshwater hearing process, limited appeal rights, could be operative sooner. Drawback, less council control over the process and hearing panel appointments. However, you do still get to adopt the decision at the end of the process. Okay, and this is the slide about costs. So as Lisa and I both kind of touched on in our discussion, PCA for notification decisions could cost between $600,000 and $1 million. This doesn't include responding to appeals. Costs can be covered within the existing planning budget, but it will come down to if you think that that is a good use of our ratepayer money for the time that we have left to operate under this planning framework. The Section 32 evaluation has pointed to it being a good, efficient use of ratepayer money partially because of the uncertainty of the amount of time reform may take, but also because we know that there are things that, infrastructure projects in particular, that can't happen right now. And this is the next step slide. So this is what happens next. Council decisions, then public notification. And so once we get into public notification, we have specific amounts of time that we are able to do each thing within. So therefore, we'd be notifying a summary of submissions in October 2026. So people submit on the plan, we read through the plan change, we read through all the submissions, we summarise them, then people get a chance to look at that summary and decide if they want to further submit on those submission points. Then we'd be looking at a hearing in early 2027 and then decision on plan change in July 2028. Or no later than July 2028. That's with the freshwater planning process. Yeah.
Yes.
For both? Both. And that's it.
Thank you. It's a long time.
It is, yeah. Planning takes a long time.
The decisions could potentially be earlier if if there's not much in contention in the hearing. We could get a decision out much earlier than 2 years, but there's a limit on we need to have a decision sort of within 2 years of having notified it.
Councillor Campbell, then Councillor Robinson.
I have two questions, both of which are clarifying that I remember correctly what you said in the last briefing. The first is that if notified and both are in play, the planning decision is to go with the most restrictive option. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and my second question that I also just want to clarify is last time you said that because of the costs involved, you would come back to us after receiving submissions for us to decide whether we want to continue. Is that still your intention?
There's a nuance to the answer here. The council retains the ability to withdraw a plan change up until the point at which appeals start being heard, and those are appeals either to the Environment Court or to the High Court. So as a governing body, you have the power to withdraw a plan change right the way through that process. There is not, though, a formal step in Schedule 1 that requires a positive decision from the council to continue on with a plan change. Effectively, your decision to notify means you continue on unless or until you then say, no, we want to withdraw. So you've got that ability. Sometimes it happens, something changes and there's a need to reconsider. So you have that ability. Effectively, council would then send a signal saying, we want to consider this again, and you would then receive a paper and some advice from staff, and you could make the decision to withdraw. But it's not a formal step in the process itself.
So just to make sure I've got that clear, if after reading submissions we all looked at them and thought this is going to take forever, or words to that effect, it would be up to us to say to staff, give us a paper on whether it's wise to continue or withdraw. But we could do that.
Yes, you could. It's the type of thing you might raise through the chair with the chief executive and seek some further advice on that.
That would only be through Schedule 1 planning process, not through the freshwater planning process?
My understanding is you've got the right to withdraw a plan change and that survives that freshwater planning process as well. Okay. I will check that, but I didn't understand it was a right ousted.
That'd be good to know, yeah. Genevieve or Councillor Robinson.
Just a question for clarification on public notification. It says here on page 26, once notified, the proposed plan change rules will operate in parallel with existing rules. Does that mean that it takes effect at that moment?
Yes. But you've got to comply with both sets of rules, and it's the most stringent that will apply from an activity status perspective. And then there's a weighting exercise in relation to matters of policy that those giving effect or considering applications for consent need to undertake.
So in effect, they legally take effect but have no effect because the prohibited activity status, I think, in most cases would... Sorry. I know it's crazy planning speak, but the prohibited activity status would stop applications, I think, for some activities.
It's just going back to that, because isn't there element somewhere in the law that says that if something has been tested and it's like it's questionable, you only have like 3 months or something in which to test it or challenge it?
Yes, there is that section 83, and it relates to things that aren't the things we're managing here. If the concern is whether the notification of this plan change overrides, for example, the Supreme Court decision in Awa immediately, it does not. So what happens for activities that are currently prohibited in the plan, the activity status of those will not change until Plan Change 8 is made operative, having followed a hearing process. But we've got other activities, and I might pick on some of the wetlands where, let's say it's currently a non-complying activity in the plan, and the notified rule is restricted discretionary. It's still non-complying, but the new policy guidance would become relevant when assessing that application.
John, anything? Nick? Claire? Andrea? Ian, anything? Megan? Sarah?
So instead of, you've went for permitted wetlands instead of controlled wetlands. Is it quite, what was the basis of, going to permitted? I know.
Largely because the purpose of that part of the plan change is to try to reduce the cost of constructing wetlands and reduce the regulatory barriers. And a controlled activity means that a consent's still required. And once you're in the consent process, it's pretty hard to minimise costs, no matter what you say in the rule. So it was really that a controlled activity pathway isn't all that much different or better than the existing plan. I should say I think that's still the sort of thing that will be considered through submissions, and that will be useful to see what the feedback is on that proposal.
Ashley, anything else? Genevieve, anything else? And Nick, anything else? Okay, you're all good. Well, it looks like we've gone through and finished that. So thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of information. That Section 32 report, like Megan was saying, was really good. So thank you for providing that, doing that, and giving us the information today. Appreciate it. Who was on karakia to close the day? I'll invite Councillor Campbell to close us with karakia.
Unahia, unahia. Unahia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia watia, kia mama tinakau. Kia tinana te wairua te ara takatu. Koia rā e rongo whakaria ake ki runga. Kia tina, tina, hui e, tai ki e.